Joseph Andriano was born in 1967 in a small town in New York State to a middle-class family, where his parents tried to instill in their children basic values such as respect for work, responsibility, and independence. Joseph's father was an electrician and his mother was a school teacher. He had a younger sister with whom he remained close throughout his adult life. From childhood, Joseph was known for his calm and thoughtful nature. He was a good listener and rarely got into conflicts, preferring to focus on his own goals and studies. During his school years, he did not stand out in sports, but showed an interest in the exact sciences, participated in math and physics competitions, and dreamed of a future career that would allow him to help others while maintaining a stable income. After graduating from high school, Joseph enrolled in college in Arizona, where he chose a major in management because he wanted to pursue a career in business and was considering starting his own business or working in housing management. His studies came easily to him, and he combined them with part-time jobs in the service industry so that he would not be completely dependent on his parents, maintaining his independence and gradually learning how to interact with customers. In his senior year of college, he met a group of students who were involved in campus activities, and one day at an event related to student housing, he met Wendy Ochoa. At the time, she was attending the same college, interested in event planning and volunteer work, and their acquaintance began with a discussion about how to improve student life, which gradually developed into a closer relationship. The relationship between Joseph and Wendy developed rapidly, as both were outgoing and genuinely interested in each other's opinions about their plans for the future. They frequented small cafes, studied for exams together, and discussed the prospect of starting a family after graduation. According to their friends, they seemed like a well-balanced couple, with Joseph bringing calmness and rationality to the relationship, and Wendy adding emotion and energy, pushing him toward new plans. After graduating from college, they decided to officially register their relationship, and in January 1994, they were married in Arizona, surrounded by a small circle of relatives and friends. They then rented a small apartment in the Ahwatukee neighborhood of Phoenix, where Joseph got a job with a company that provided maintenance services for residential complexes. Wendy soon became the manager of the residential complex where they later settled. Their marriage seemed happy, as a few years later they had children, and Joseph took an active part in raising them, despite his busy work schedule. He often spent evenings with his children, reading to them or playing with them, paying attention to keeping the house tidy and trying to help Wendy with household chores. The family lived modestly but stably, and neighbors noted that they seemed like a typical young family with a respectful and harmonious relationship. Outwardly, there were no signs of serious discord in their lives, and Wendy and Joseph's acquaintances often said that they complemented each other well. The situation began to change in 1998, when Joseph began complaining of pain and discomfort, which were initially perceived as minor health problems related to fatigue and stress at work. However, after extensive testing, he was diagnosed with a rare disease that was incurable and required constant monitoring, which was a serious challenge for the family. Despite his declining health, Joseph continued to work as much as he could and participated in the lives of his children and household chores. During this period, Wendy continued to work while caring for her children and helping her husband, which took a toll on her physical and emotional well-being. By 2000, Joseph's condition had deteriorated significantly, and he began undergoing treatment involving intensive therapy, leaving him bedridden or confined to his home for most of the time. The situation required Wendy to devote constant attention to her husband and children, which put a strain on her schedule as she also continued to perform her duties as complex manager. At the same time, their life continued to appear orderly, and neighbors noted that Wendy still tried to maintain the appearance of a stable family, although she sometimes appeared irritable. On the morning of October 8, 2000, emergency services received a call reporting that a man in an apartment was unwell and that his wife had stated that he had requested that no intensive measures be taken and that he wished to spend his last days in peace. The team that arrived at the scene assessed the patient's condition, but taking into account the wife's words and the absence of any visible signs of acute danger to life, left the apartment, deciding that medical intervention was not necessary in this case. About an hour after they left, the emergency services received a second call from the same apartment, reporting that the man in question had stopped showing signs of life. Emergency services and police officers arrived at the scene again, pronounced the man dead, and began the standard documentation procedure, seeing no signs of a violent death. At that moment, none of those who arrived expressed any suspicions, and the neighbors perceived what was happening as a tragic death at home caused by serious illness and exhaustion, and the family seemed like just another story in which illness had taken the life of a young man, leaving his wife and children in a state of grief and uncertainty. No one knew that a murder had already been committed at that moment, and that behind the seemingly peaceful death in the apartment lay circumstances that would lead to one of the most high-profile trials in Arizona, changing the fate of Wendy Andriano and leaving questions that the police had yet to answer. In the apartment complex in the Ahwatukee neighborhood where Joseph and Wendy Andriano lived with their children, the morning silence was broken only by the sounds of police and medical personnel responding to a death call. The dim light from a lamp left on in the kitchen cast soft shadows, making the place look peaceful despite the tragedy at its center. The front door remained open, allowing cool air to slowly flow through the hallway, where Joseph Andriano's body lay on the floor next to the kitchen, motionless, with his arms spread out to the sides, dressed in his home clothes, neatly folded but with noticeable stains that had appeared before his death. During the initial examination of Joseph's face and head, police officers and medics noted abrasions and bruises on his forehead and temples, leaving marks that were difficult to attribute to an accidental fall. Next to the body, at the edge of the kitchen, was an overturned stool with dents and scratches that looked fresh, as if the object had been subjected to significant stress before ending up on the floor. Its location and damage immediately caught the attention of the forensic photographers, as such details could later point to the events leading up to the death. Several medicine bottles were scattered on the artificial stone kitchen counter, some of which were open, and next to them was a cup with the remains of a liquid of an unusual color. Medical personnel and police officers recorded these details, as Joseph's illness could have required medication as part of his care, but it could also indicate possible dosage irregularities. Next to the cup were prescriptions, utility bills, and notes about medication, which were part of the orderly routine of a family coping with Joseph's serious illness. Despite the signs of orderliness, the eye was drawn to small details that spoke of the family's life before the incident. Children's toys lay on the floor in the hallway, left behind by the children while they played, and family photos hung on the refrigerator, creating a contrast between the children's drawings and what was happening. In the photos, Joseph was smiling, holding his children in his arms, with Wendy next to him, and these images reminded us that the apartment still had an atmosphere of family life, even in the midst of illness. The police began treating the incident as a natural death, as Wendy explained that Joseph had been feeling worse the night before and that the family knew his condition was deteriorating due to illness. The ambulance that arrived earlier had recorded a deterioration in his condition, but according to Wendy, assistance was refused because her husband allegedly did not want intervention. The officers continued to follow standard procedure, recording the location of the body and objects, and taking statements from Wendy, who appeared emotionally distraught but tried to answer questions and provide information about her husband's illness. However, forensic experts examining the body noted that the nature of the injuries did not fully correspond to the typical consequences of a fall. The bruises and abrasions on Joseph's head were located and numerous in a way that required further explanation, and the damage to the stool could indicate impact related to force rather than a simple fall. The experts decided to send the body for an autopsy and subsequent toxicological analysis to determine the exact cause of death and check for the presence of medications or other substances in Joseph's body. At this stage, police continued to treat the incident as a natural death in the home of a sick man who was cared for by his family, and did not speculate on possible criminal circumstances. However, minor details recorded in the reports remained in the database for analysis, as they would later change the course of the investigation and reveal signs of foul play hidden behind the facade of a tragic but seemingly natural death in the apartment of Joseph and Wendy Andriano. In the days following Joseph Andriano's death, the procedure for determining the cause of death was carried out according to standard protocols, which included an autopsy and laboratory tests to confirm the official version of natural causes. The forensic experts who performed the autopsy on Joseph's body noted multiple injuries to the head, localized in the temporal and frontal regions, as well as on the back of the head, which raised questions about their origin. The injuries varied in depth and nature, including hematomas incompatible with a single fall, even taking into account the weakened condition of the patient who was undergoing treatment. It was established that the blows were directed and their number indicated multiple impacts, which was inconsistent with the explanation of an accidental incident. Substances were also found in Joseph's body that did not match the usual range of drugs prescribed to maintain his condition. These substances were of interest to toxicologists, as in combination with the traces of drugs found, they could indicate a possible effect that affected the functioning of vital organs and Joseph's general condition at the time of death. Blood and tissue analyses revealed indicators that required further investigation, as when combined with the effects of trauma, they could paint a picture that went beyond natural causes. The results of the autopsy and toxicological studies were forwarded to the police, where analysts began to compare the data with statements previously given by Joseph's wife, Wendy Andriano, and other individuals related to the family. Police officers began to reanalyze the events of the night, comparing the time frame between the first emergency call and the second call, which reported Joseph's departure. Wendy's statements contained inconsistencies regarding the description of her husband's deteriorating condition, when she noticed the changes and what actions were taken to help him. These discrepancies were minor at first glance, but when combined with the conclusions of the medical examiners, they began to form a picture that required clarification of the details of what had happened in the apartment during the night. At the same time, police officers interviewed neighbors who lived in apartments next to Joseph and Wendy's apartment. The neighbors said that at night, between 1 o'clock and 2 o'clock a.m., they heard noises coming from the apartment where the family lived. These sounds were described as banging and thumping, but at the time no one paid much attention to them, assuming that they were caused by objects falling or furniture being moved around at night, which sometimes happened in the apartments in the complex. None of the neighbors associated these sounds with a possible incident, as there were no screams or sounds of a struggle, and the situation seemed normal. During the investigation, police officers paid attention to the family's financial situation and began to explore possible motives that could explain the situation if Joseph's departure was unnatural. During the investigation, it was established that Wendy had repeatedly consulted on matters relating to her husband's life insurance policy and had inquired about the details of receiving payments in the event of the death of a person undergoing treatment for a serious illness. It was also established that she had discussed the possibility of filing complaints about errors in Joseph's treatment, considering the potential for compensation, which in itself was not a violation of the law, but indicated an interest in the financial aspects of the possible consequences of her husband's death. These facts raised questions for investigators, as taken together with the injuries and foreign substances found in the body, they could indicate motives related to the family's finances. At this stage, the police did not bring any formal charges, and the suspect's name was not made public, as the case was still under investigation and the full picture of what had happened was being established. Formally, the investigation followed a procedure involving the collection of statements, analysis of evidence, obtaining expert opinions, and examining the family's financial and social ties in order to understand how Joseph's last weeks had been and what events might have preceded his departure. The police did not rule out the possibility that his death could have been the result of a combination of circumstances in the context of serious illness, But the facts that emerged as the analysis deepened did not fit into the usual medical scenario, and certain details of Wendy's testimony began to diverge from the findings of the experts. The investigation recorded every step, maintaining an outward appearance of restraint, as any premature conclusions could have influenced the course of the case and subsequently complicated the process of bringing formal charges. At this stage, the focus was on facts related to the nature of Joseph's injuries, the presence of substances in his body that raised additional questions among toxicologists, inconsistencies in the accounts of the night's events, and information that the family's financial situation was the subject of active discussion. Taken together, these details gradually formed internal suspicions among police officers that something had happened in the apartment on the night before Joseph's departure that did not correspond to the officially stated version, but formally the case remained at the investigation stage, where key steps and conclusions were yet to be made. This was a stage when the circumstances were coming together, but did not allow for a specific person to be identified, as this required confirmed evidence that could form the basis for an official charge. Several months had passed since that morning of October 8, 2000, when police officers first recorded Joseph Andriano leaving his apartment in Ahwatukee, and during that time, behind the facade of outward calm and routine checks, intensive analytical work was underway, step by step forming a coherent picture of what had happened. By this time, investigators had already obtained the full results of the autopsy and toxicology reports conducted by Arizona State medical examiners. These documents, each line of which reflected the experts' conclusions based on physical evidence, tissue, and bodily fluids from Joseph's body, became the key that allowed the police to take the next step. The official conclusion of the medical examiners stated that the injuries found on Joseph's body were not consistent with a natural death. The experts noted that the number and location of the injuries indicated multiple blows to the head and face with a blunt object, and the nature of the injuries indicated blows delivered with considerable force directed at specific areas. These findings refuted the possibility of an accidental fall, as initially suggested by Wendy Andriano, and led investigators to examine the events of that night from the perspective that Joseph's death may have been the result of another person's actions. At the same time as analyzing the injuries, toxicologists completed their examination of Joseph's stomach contents, blood, and tissues, confirming the presence of substances in his body that were not part of the standard treatment prescribed by doctors to alleviate his condition. These substances could have affected Joseph's general condition, reducing his level of consciousness and physical activity, rendering him virtually incapable of active movement, which was critical in the context of what was happening. Evidence emerged that the substances had been administered shortly before death, creating a state in which the person was unable to resist or control his body. The police decided to re-interview Wendy Andriano to clarify the details of the events of the night of October 7-8, 2000. During the interview, officers asked questions about what medications Joseph was taking, who prepared the medications for him and in what form, and at what point she realized that his condition was deteriorating. A comparison of her new explanations with her initial testimony revealed discrepancies regarding the time of the deterioration and the actions taken before the second call to emergency services. Investigators analyzed every detail, recording the time intervals between the first and second calls and comparing this with the time when the blows could have been inflicted, as well as with the period when the substances found in Joseph's body appeared. The investigation also conducted a parallel analysis of Joseph's medical records, confirming that in recent weeks he had been in a state of physical weakness and unable to resist, even in a conflict. This fact refuted the possible version of a struggle mentioned in Wendy Andriano's statements, as forensic experts determined that Joseph's physical condition was extremely poor, and he was unable to get out of bed without assistance or actively defend himself in a conflict. These conclusions became a significant part of the evidence base, showing that the events of that night could not have been the result of a mutual confrontation. An important part of the investigation was the data collected on Wendy Andriano's financial activity in the months leading up to the tragedy. It was established that she had repeatedly sought advice on taking out a life insurance policy for Joseph, and was interested in the details of receiving payments in the event of his death. In addition, the investigation obtained testimony from family acquaintances and insurance agency employees, where Wendy inquired about the amounts of payments and the terms of policy review, demonstrating a sustained interest in these issues. Attempts were also identified to obtain advice on filing complaints against Joseph's doctors, which could have led to payments in the event of alleged medical malpractice, adding to the financial motive considered by the investigation. Key evidence came from phone records and contacts, which showed calls and meetings about insurance stuff, as well as witness statements about hearing Wendy talk about financial problems and possible ways to solve them if Joseph passed away. This information, combined with the forensic experts' conclusions about the nature of the injuries and the presence of substances in the body, allowed the police to bring formal charges based on documents and testimony that pointed to a direct link between Wendy Andriano and the circumstances of her husband's death. On the morning of January 15, 2001, Phoenix police officers arrived at the apartment where Wendy Andriano lived with her children to execute an arrest warrant. She was at home that day, continuing to take care of her children and household chores, when the officers informed her of the reason for their visit and presented her with the arrest documents. The arrest took place in a calm atmosphere, as Wendy did not resist but remained outwardly confused, trying to control her emotions in the presence of her children and the police officers. She was taken to the police station for questioning and processing, where she was officially charged with first-degree murder of Joseph Andriano. After Wendy Andriano's arrest, the investigation moved into the final stage of gathering evidence and preparing a complete file for referral to the court. Preparations began for the trial, which was to establish all the circumstances of the incident, evaluate the evidence gathered, hear testimony from witnesses and experts, and determine the legal classification of Wendy's actions on the night her husband left. The police and prosecutors continued to gather the final pieces of evidence, interviewing witnesses, examining financial documents, telephone records, and medical data, forming an indictment that would soon form the basis of a trial capable of putting an end to one of the most high-profile cases in Phoenix, where behind the facade of an ordinary family life lay a story that ended in tragedy, and the beginning of proceedings in which the court would decide the fate of Wendy Andriano. After Wendy Andriano's arrest in January 2001, the Maricopa County Prosecutor's Office, together with detectives, began to complete the investigation and prepare the materials that would form the basis of the trial. The prosecution based its case on the evidence gathered, the conclusions of forensic experts, and witness testimony, constructing a version of events in which Joseph Andriano's death was the result of deliberate actions committed for financial gain, emphasizing that at the time of the incident, the man was in a state that prevented him from resisting. The trial began on August 23, 2004, in the Maricopa County Courthouse. The trial was presided over by a judge known for his careful analysis of the case and strict adherence to procedure. The hearings were open to the public, attracting the interest of local media and journalists who covered the trial from the courtroom. The prosecution was represented by a team of prosecutors who consistently presented their case based on the autopsy results, toxicology reports, and financial documents related to Wendy's interest in taking out an insurance policy and receiving compensation. The prosecution argued that Wendy deliberately administered substances to Joseph to render him completely helpless, after which she struck him on the head with a blunt object, causing his death. During the trial, witnesses included emergency medical personnel who arrived at the apartment on the day of the incident, neighbors who heard noise on the night of the tragedy, and insurance agency employees with whom Wendy had communicated in the months leading up to the incident. The prosecution provided the court with documents confirming Wendy's consultations on insurance policy issues, as well as her attempts to find out the procedure for payments in the event of her husband's death. The court heard experts who confirmed that the substances found in Joseph's body were not part of his mandatory treatment and could have been administered externally, creating an effect that rendered him unable to defend himself. The defense attorneys based their case on the fact that Wendy was acting under stress caused by her husband's serious illness and denied any intent to commit a deliberate crime. The defense tried to present the incident as a tragedy, resulting from a combination of difficult circumstances, arguing that Wendy's actions were necessary and defensive at the time of the alleged conflict. Wendy testified in person, describing the difficulties of caring for her sick husband and the emotional pressure she was under, pointing out that there had allegedly been conflicts in their family, exacerbated by Joseph's illness. The hearings continued for several months, during which dozens of pieces of evidence were examined and numerous witnesses and experts were heard. The court carefully analyzed the data, comparing it with Wendy's testimony and the conclusions of forensic experts, who emphasized that Joseph's injuries could not have been sustained accidentally or as a result of a conflict on his part, as the man's physical condition ruled out the possibility of resistance. Documents relating to Wendy's financial interests were examined, including her attempts to settle her husband's life insurance and her interest in possible payments from medical institutions. As the trial drew to a close, it became clear that the evidence gathered by the prosecution and the expert testimony were sufficient to secure a conviction. The final hearings were devoted to closing arguments, during which the prosecution emphasized the sequence of events on the night of October 8, 2000, as confirmed by the timing of emergency calls, toxicology findings, and the nature of Joseph's injuries. On November 18, 2004, the Maricopa County Court found Wendy Andriano guilty of first-degree murder in the death of Joseph Andriano. On December 22, 2004, she was sentenced to death. Rebecca Lynn Gould was born on February 18, 1982 in San Angelo, Texas. She was the second of 4 daughters in a family characterized by intellectualism, mutual understanding, and discipline. Her father, Larry Gould, taught criminology and sociology at a college and conducted research in the field of justice. Her mother, Diana Gould, worked in medical administration and raised her children, balancing her career with her family life. The Gould home valued books, long conversations at the dinner table, respect for opinions, and a thirst for knowledge. From an early age, Rebecca showed a lively mind and a penchant for the humanities. She read more than her peers, was attentive to detail, and was interested in languages and music. In high school, she participated in the school newspaper, volunteered, and took additional French courses. Teachers and peers described her as a calm, thoughtful girl with a strong sense of justice. At the same time, she was not withdrawn. On the contrary, she was able to form warm, trusting relationships, although she kept herself out of the spotlight. After graduating from high school, Rebecca enrolled at the University of Arkansas in Fayetteville, choosing to study applied linguistics. At the same time, she worked part-time in a music store, played the piano, and was actively involved in intercultural student projects. She had a clear goal: to go abroad in a few years to teach English, possibly in France or Japan. Her life followed a predictable but fulfilling path: school, work, friends, family. She kept in touch with her relatives, wrote letters, and visited her younger sisters. She met Casey McCullough in Fayetteville at a cafe where a student event was taking place. He was from Melbourne, a small town in northern Arkansas, and worked in logistics. Calm, quiet, but attentive, he immediately stood out from the crowd. Their relationship developed gradually, without drama or scenes. Casey often invited Rebecca to his hometown to show her around and introduce her to his friends. She felt comfortable in Melbourne, especially in Casey's father's house, a one-story brick house on Mokula Trail surrounded by pine forest. There was a fireplace, an old library, and a piano. It was this combination of comfort and seclusion that Rebecca particularly liked. In September 2004, after the start of the fall semester, Rebecca returned to Melbourne. She planned to stay for the weekend and return to the university on Monday morning. Casey was going away to visit friends for a couple of days and offered her to stay at the house alone. She agreed. She was last seen on Monday morning, September 20, at a local laundromat. She dropped off her laundry, picked up her clean clothes, exchanged a few words with the owner, and left. There were no signs of distress. She looked calm, dressed in everyday clothes, jeans, a light sweater, and sneakers. It was her usual morning routine. Casey returned on Tuesday evening, September 21. The house greeted him with a strange, suffocating silence. The door was unlocked. Inside, there was a feeling of unnatural disorder. Towels were scattered in the hallway, and there was water in the bathroom sink as if someone had washed their hands in a hurry. In the living room, the furniture had been moved slightly, and there was a pillow on the floor. In the bedroom, the mattress had been moved and the sheets were crumpled. On one of them was a dark stain that looked like blood. He called out to Rebecca, but there was no answer. Her cell phone, keys, and wallet were on the nightstand. The contact lenses she wore every day were in their case. Everything indicated that she had no intention of leaving the house. Rebecca's car was parked in the driveway, locked but with no signs of movement. Casey started calling her friends, but no one knew where she was. For a while, he hesitated, hoping she had just gone for a walk. But with every passing minute, that seemed less and less likely. Not wanting to jump to conclusions, he called several of her friends again, and when he got no answer, called the police. At around 6:00 p.m. that day, officers from the Izard County Sheriff's Office arrived at the house. When the first officers from the Izard County Sheriff's Office arrived at 15 Makula Trail at around 6:40 p.m. on September 21, 2004, they had no idea that they were about to encounter a case that would become the most difficult of their careers. The call came from Casey McCulloch, who reported a disturbance at the house and the disappearance of his girlfriend, Rebecca Gould. He insisted that her belongings were still inside. Her car was parked at the entrance, but she was nowhere to be found, and he was unable to contact her. The police arrived in 2 cars. One of the officers, Deputy Sheriff Charlie Melton, was the first to enter the house, armed with a notebook and a camera. In the hallway, he was met by a strange smell. Not rotten, but distinctly musty, as if someone had hurriedly tried to clean the place. The house wasn't very big, a typical 1-story detached house with 3 rooms, a living room, and a kitchen, built back in the 1970s. The windows were closed and the lights were off. An awkward, still silence reigned in the house. First, the investigators examined the hallway and living room. Everything looked almost normal except for one thing. A pillow was lying on the floor by the sofa, and the coffee table had been moved to one side. On it stood a bottle of water with fingerprints still visible on the surface. In the corner of the living room stood an old upright piano, dark brown in color. On closer inspection, it appeared that one of the legs of the instrument had been partially detached. On the floor beneath the piano lay a wooden pin with traces of varnish and a crack that was clearly not accidental. This item was recorded in the report and later identified as a potential weapon. In the kitchen area, investigators found no signs of a struggle. However, there was a half-peeled pear and a knife on the countertop. This indicated that Rebecca had been cooking or eating at some point. There were 2 cups in the sink. Everything looked calm but sterile, as if someone had tried to clean up afterwards. One strange thing was a bag of bread left on the floor near the refrigerator. The bedroom attracted the most attention. According to investigators, this was where the incident that would later be classified as an assault took place. The bed was in disarray. The mattress had been moved and the sheets had been thrown onto the headboard. On one of them, closer to the center, there was an irregularly shaped dark stain that had soaked into the fabric. Analysis showed that it was blood. A little later, a reagent test confirmed the presence of blood stains on the inside of the mattress. The blood had not splattered, but had been absorbed into the surface, indicating that the victim had been lying or in the same position for some time. There was a nightlight above the bedside table. Under it were Rebecca's neatly folded contact lenses, her wallet, and her cell phone. Her documents, bank card, and even her student ID were still inside. This sharply contradicted the version that the girl had left of her own accord. No one, especially a student, would leave home without their personal belongings, let alone contact lenses which are needed every day. everything pointed to a sudden interruption in her normal routine. Particular attention was drawn to the absence of one of the blankets that had previously been on the bed. Casey claimed that it was definitely there when he left. Its absence was noted in the report. This fact seemed insignificant, until it turned out that a week later, when Rebecca's body was found, it was wrapped in that very blanket. This detail would later play a key role in reconstructing the events. The officers then proceeded to the bathroom. There were more traces here. Towels were wet and scattered across the floor. One of them had a blood stain on the edge. The sink was filled with murky water, as if someone had washed their hands in a hurry and not dried the bathroom afterwards. There were small splashes on the mirror, barely visible but captured in the photo. Inside the laundry basket were clothes, but according to Casey, some items were missing. It later turned out that Rebecca's pajamas were gone. There were no signs of forced entry. The locks were undamaged, the windows were closed from the inside, and there were no scratches or marks on the door frames. There were no signs of theft in the house. Appliances, jewelry, money, everything was in its place. This indicated that either the perpetrator was familiar with the victim and gained access voluntarily, or took advantage of the fact that the door was unlocked. Rebecca's car, a white Hyundai sedan, was parked in the driveway. Inside was a bag with textbooks, a couple of CDs, a notebook with notes, and a planner for the week. In the trunk was a neatly folded gym bag. The car was locked. Everything looked as if she was getting ready to leave, but she never did. The next morning, September 22, 2004, Rebecca Gould was officially reported missing. The county sheriff's office launched a full investigation. The house on Makula Trail was completely isolated, and county crime scene investigators and technical specialists were called in. Blood samples were taken, fingerprints were lifted from surfaces, and clothing and household items with possible biological traces were seized. The piano, whose leg was damaged, was dismantled. Microscopic traces of blood found on its end later confirmed that it had been used in the attack. Initially, investigators considered several versions, ranging from an accident to a robbery that turned into a conflict. However, the absence of signs of forced entry, the safety of valuables, and the nature of the disorder in the house quickly narrowed the circle of suspects. Everything pointed to the fact that Rebecca knew the person who caused her disappearance. At the same time, a search was launched in the surrounding area. Over the next 2 days, volunteers, officers, and dog handlers combed the nearby woods, riverbanks, and ravines, but neither the body nor any new clues were found. By this point, the police realized that this was not just a case of disappearance, but most likely a violent crime with fatal consequences. Although the evidence was circumstantial at that point, the crime scene spoke for itself. The bedroom, bathroom, damaged furniture, blood, and the absence of any signs of a struggle or escape all pointed to the fact that a crime had been committed in this house, in silence, and without witnesses, the consequences of which would soon shock not only the small town of Melbourne, but the entire state of Arkansas. Rebecca Gould's body was found on September 28, 2004, 8 days after she went missing. It was found by random passers-by on the side of Highway 9 on the outskirts of Izard County, about 5 miles from Melbourne. The body was lying in a ravine on a slope, covered with tall grass and partially by branches. It was wrapped in a blanket that immediately looked familiar to investigators. When the process was completed, it presented that the body was concealed from the bed in a beacon of blanket that was missing from the bed in the house where Rebecca had been living before her disappearance. It became the first direct link between the house and the place where the body was found. Forensic experts determined that death was caused by a traumatic brain injury, resulting from repeated blows with a blunt object. According to the pathologist's report, the time of death was consistent with the morning or early afternoon of September 20, the day she was last seen alive. The discovery of the body gave investigators more solid ground to work on. The house on Makula Trail was now officially considered a crime scene, and the investigative team from the Izard County Sheriff's Office entered a more decisive phase. Initial efforts focused on gathering evidence and interviewing those closest to her. Dozens of people were questioned, including Casey McCullough, Rebecca's ex-boyfriend with whom she had been living at the time of her disappearance, as well as his father, neighbors, college friends, co-workers, and even casual acquaintances. The investigators were primarily interested in time frames. Who was where between September 18 and 21? Casey, as the last person to have contact with Rebecca, naturally found himself the focus of attention. However, his alibi was confirmed. He was out of town, in Mono, 120 kilometers from Melbourne, in the company of several friends. These friends gave consistent statements, and phone records, bank card transactions, and even data on his movements confirmed his story. This did not completely clear him of suspicion, but it moved him from the category of primary suspects to that of key witnesses. As part of further investigations, polygraph tests were conducted. Casey passed the test, as did several people from his circle, including his father, a couple of neighbors, and 2 acquaintances who had visited the house earlier. Some of the polygraph results were inconclusive. Several people showed stress reactions to questions about their knowledge of the details of the crime. However, according to modern methodological standards, the polygraph itself is not evidence, and these findings were recorded in the reports but did not lead to arrests. At the same time, work began on physical evidence. Traces of biological material were collected from the bedroom, bathroom, living room, and even from furniture, blood, hair, and epithelial microparticles. Fingerprints were taken from several surfaces, including door handles, the leg of a piano, which, as it later turned out, was the murder weapon, and a water bottle found on the table. Unfortunately, the forensic technology available in 2004 did not allow for in-depth genetic analysis of weak and scattered samples. Databases were limited, and none of the prints found matched any existing criminal records. Investigators turned to the Federal Bureau of Investigation for help. In particular, the FBI was called in to compile a behavioral profile of the alleged perpetrator. Experts suggested that the perpetrator most likely knew Rebecca, had access to the house, acted alone, and may have had personal feelings for her, both romantic and possibly envy or anger. The profile was fairly typical, did not provide a specific name, but confirmed suspicions that the perpetrator was not a random passerby. Rebecca's past connections were analyzed, including people she studied with, worked with, and interacted with on social media. But they were all gradually ruled out, some because of alibis, some because of lack of motive, and some because of the results of additional checks. However, despite the extensive work done, by the end of 2005 the case began to stall. The word insufficient appeared more and more often in investigators' reports. Not enough evidence, not enough testimony, not enough logical connections. Although the case remained active, the pace of the investigation slowed. The reasons for this were both internal and external. First, there was no obvious motive. Rebecca was a gentle person who did not conflict with those around her, had no known enemies, and did not lead a risky lifestyle. None of the messages on her phone or in her email contained any threats. None of her acquaintances suggested any hidden conflicts. Her disappearance seemed sudden and inexplicable, even to those closest to her. Second, the crime took place in a house located in an isolated part of the city, which ruled out the possibility of witnesses. No neighbors heard any suspicious noises, and no surveillance cameras recorded anything unusual, simply because there were none in the area. The time frame between Casey's departure and her return home gave the perpetrator the opportunity to act without fear of interference. Adding to the complexity and pressure was the local community. Melbourne is a small town where everyone knows everyone, and any crime becomes the subject of public discussion. Investigators were constantly faced with a flood of rumors, speculation, and informal accusations. Some claimed to have seen Rebecca in a car with a stranger on the day of her disappearance. Some speculated that jealousy was the motive. All of this distracted attention from the main task at hand, finding facts. Some witnesses refused to speak officially, fearing publicity or public condemnation. According to unconfirmed reports, in the first days after Rebecca's disappearance, the house where she lived was not immediately cordoned off. This allowed people to move around it, possibly even removing or tampering with evidence. It was this loss of control over the crime scene that may have cost the investigation several critically important pieces of information. The police report later acknowledged that the initial examination of the premises was incomplete and delayed. Thus, by 2006, the Rebecca Gould case had been classified as hanging, active but without active progress. It remained open, but work on it was sporadic. Investigators came and went, and evidence was moved from one archive to another. The community continued to remember Rebecca, and memorial events were held every year. Her father, Dr. Larry Gould, repeated in every interview, "I will find who did this." But there were still no answers, and William Miller's name did not appear in any official version for almost 15 years. Almost 14 years after the tragedy, in the fall of 2018, the Rebecca Gould case unexpectedly returned to the public spotlight. This was thanks to a podcast created by private journalist and writer Catherine Townsend. The podcast was called Helen Gone and was dedicated to unsolved crimes in small American towns. Townsend, who had previously worked in London and then in New York, was personally familiar with Arkansas and decided to devote the first season of her project to the Rebecca Gould case. Her approach differed from traditional journalistic investigations. She didn't just retell the case, but traveled to Melbourne herself, talked to local residents, Rebecca's friends, police officers, retired officers, and even people who had previously been considered suspects. Her interviews were detailed, accurate, and unsensational, which quickly earned her listeners' trust. The podcast went viral. After the first episodes were released, it was covered by regional media and then by national publications. Under pressure from public interest and constant press coverage, the case was reopened in 2019 by the Arkansas Cold Case Unit. The FBI joined the investigation. The new team included not only operatives, but also digital forensics analysts using technologies that were either unavailable or in their infancy in 2004. The main task was to re-examine evidence that had previously yielded no results. It was particularly important to go through all of Rebecca's connections, including people who had appeared in interviews, phone records, and documents, but for one reason or another, had not been the subject of a targeted investigation. One of the key innovations was the use of digital forensics. Analysis of old phone calls, including those made from the McCullough home phone, and comparison of the geolocation of mobile devices recorded in the area of the house on the morning of September 20, 2004, made it possible to reconstruct the movements and calls with a high degree of accuracy. In addition, a cross-check was conducted of the routes of vehicles registered on highway cameras and in gas station and retail outlet logs during those days. All of this revealed new connections between objects and people. During this analysis, a name that had not previously been considered a priority came to the attention of investigators. William Alma Miller, Casey McCullough's maternal uncle. In 2004, he was in Arkansas, including the Melbourne area, but did not live there permanently, moved frequently, and left the state shortly after Rebecca's disappearance. In old statements, he was referred to as a family acquaintance, but the case never went to a detailed interrogation at that time. New methods made it possible to match his movements with activity around the house on the morning of September 20. At the same time, a check was carried out for possible biological traces, and although the DNA in the case still did not give a definite result, the overall body of evidence allowed law enforcement to obtain a warrant to question Miller. As of 2020, William Miller was living in Creswell, Oregon. He had changed his lifestyle, used a partially altered name, and worked in a low-skilled job, avoiding contact with the authorities. On November 7, 2020, investigators arrived at his home with a warrant for his arrest and a search warrant. Miller was detained and taken to the local police station. For 5 hours, he denied any involvement in Rebecca's disappearance. He claimed that he had not seen her in recent days, had not been at the house, was not familiar with the details of her life, and had little interest in what was happening. However, during the interrogation, under the influence of facts, contradictions in his testimony, and psychological pressure, Miller began to become confused and eventually admitted that he had indeed been at the house on the morning of September 20. According to his confession, there was an accidental conflict between him and Rebecca. He avoided giving details. He responded evasively to follow-up questions, but admitted that during the argument he lost his temper, grabbed the leg of the piano, and struck her. He was unable to explain what exactly triggered the outburst. He described his behavior as sudden rage, for which he feels guilty. After the incident, he wrapped the body in a blanket, loaded it into the back of his pickup truck, and drove out of town, where he dumped the body by the highway. He also admitted that he later attempted to cover his presence in the house by washing away traces in the bathroom and partially cleaning the premises. He did not provide any further explanation. After his confession, Miller was arrested. He initially refused voluntary extradition. Legal proceedings began to transfer him to Arkansas. In December 2020, after several hearings, he agreed to extradition. In January 2021, he was transferred to Arkansas and placed in a county detention center. On November 15, 2021, he was formally charged with first-degree murder. From that moment on, the investigation took on a new, final character. For the first time in all these years, the prosecution had a person who admitted his guilt and provided details that matched the evidence found and the testimony of witnesses. Thus, 16 years after Rebecca's disappearance, the suspect's capture was made possible by the combined efforts of a journalistic investigation, modern analytical methods, and the determination of those who had not forgotten that behind the dry term unsolved crime lies a real lost life. From that moment on, the case entered its final phase, the trial. After William Elma Miller's arrest and his confession during questioning in Oregon, the case went to trial. The charge was formulated as first-degree murder committed with a blunt object with aggravating circumstances, premeditation, attempted concealment of the body, destruction of evidence, and refusal to cooperate for nearly 2 decades. After his extradition to Arkansas in January 2021, Miller was placed in the Izard County Detention Center, where he remained under supervision until the start of the hearings. The first preliminary hearings began in the spring of 2021. The defendant made no loud statements, did not comment on the charges publicly, and refused to be interviewed by journalists. His defense was based on mitigating circumstances, no prior convictions, emotional turmoil at the time of the crime, and cooperation with the investigation during the confession stage. The prosecution, in turn, emphasized that Miller had deliberately gone into hiding for 16 years, lived under a different name, changed his place of residence, and in essence evaded justice. The fact that he lived freely while the Gould family was tormented by uncertainty became a key point in the prosecution's moral argument. The hearings were held in the District Court building in Melbourne, Arkansas. The trial attracted public interest. Journalists, local residents, and representatives of human rights organizations attended every hearing. Rebecca Gould's family was present at all the hearings. At one of them, Rebecca's father, Dr. Larry Gould, read a prepared statement addressed to the court and the defendant. His speech was calm but filled with inner pain. He said, "I promised at my daughter's funeral that I would find her killer. I have kept that promise. But no sentence will bring her back. I am not seeking revenge. I want the truth to be remembered." The hearings lasted almost a year. Miller was passive, reserved, and spoke quietly. During the hearings in October 2022, his lawyers unexpectedly proposed waiving the right to a jury trial. According to sources, this move was agreed upon with the Gould family to avoid a lengthy trial and further emotional distress. The parties agreed on the terms. In exchange for a guilty plea, the defendant would receive a fixed sentence. Not life imprisonment, but a long prison term with minimal possibility of early release. Given Arkansas law, this approach avoided appeals. On October 18, 2022, the final hearing took place. Rebecca's relatives, representatives of the prosecution, investigators who worked on the case, and journalists were present in the courtroom. Judge Tim Weaver read the sentence in silence. Before that, Miller himself was given the floor. He made a brief statement expressing regret for what had happened. "I am sorry. I cannot change this. I must take responsibility. I understand that I must serve my time." His face was expressionless. His speech was even but lacking in specifics. The judge did not believe in the sincerity of his remorse. On October 18, 2022, the Izard County Circuit Court found William Alma Miller guilty of first-degree murder committed on September 20, 2004, against Rebecca Lynn Gould. On October 19, 2022, he was sentenced to 40 years in an Arkansas state prison without the possibility of parole for at least 70% of his sentence. Kimberly Karen Mota de Oliveira was born on May 5, 1998 in the small town of Manacor in the state of Amazonas in northern Brazil. It was a town where life flowed slowly and peacefully, surrounded by river channels and tropical greenery. Her family belonged to the middle class. Her father taught history at a school, and her mother worked as a nurse at a local clinic. They raised their daughters strictly but fairly, instilling in her a strong work ethic and a sense of responsibility. Kimberly grew up shy but observant, started reading early, became interested in biology, and even in elementary school confidently said that she wanted to be a doctor. She stood out among her peers in her studies, always prepared, always asking questions with clear goals. Her report card rarely contained comments, but often praise from her teachers. After graduating from high school, she enrolled in the medical school at the Federal University of Amazonas in Manaus, one of the largest cities in the region. To do so, she had to leave her family home, travel hundreds of kilometers, and start adult life in a city where she knew no one. Her parents were proud of her, but they were also worried. Manaus was completely different, noisy, densely populated, with a rhythm that took getting used to. Kimberly rented a small room near the campus and got a job as an assistant at a private clinic. Her studies took up most of her time, but she never complained. On the contrary, she was proud of her choice and took steps to achieve her goal. In 2019, she entered a municipal beauty contest and won. She was crowned Miss Manacor 2019. From that moment on, she became a familiar face at the university, on social media, and at city events. But for Kimberly herself, it wasn't an end in itself, but an opportunity to talk to people, to help, to be heard. Her Instagram was filled with photos of her in a white coat, captions about medicine and responsibility, quotes about compassion and choice. She met Rafael Fernandez Rodriguez in February 2020 at a sports club where she worked out from time to time. He was 31, a fitness trainer with a strong build, a calm manner of speaking, and an outwardly affable demeanor. In the first weeks of their relationship, Kimberly told her friends that he was very attentive and confident. He took an interest in her studies, often asking questions and remembering details. He said he appreciated strong and intelligent women and respected her ambitions. It all started easily. Walks together, cafes, good morning messages. She saw it as a new but not risky beginning. After 2 weeks, they started dating. However, by the end of March, traits began to emerge in his behavior that Kimberly didn't want to notice at first. He became increasingly interested in where she was, who was with her, and why she took so long to respond to messages. He asked for her phone password several times, just so he could trust her. She refused. This was followed by silence, disapproving looks, and reproaches. He began to question her schedule, saying that she was always busy and not paying attention to him. In a message to a friend, she wrote, "He's changed. He controls me all the time as if I'm not a person, but his property." She began to distance herself. In mid-April, Kimberly decided to end the relationship. She didn't want any drama, she just stopped answering his calls. But Rafael didn't give up. He continued to write to her, came to her house, left notes, waited for her at the entrance to the university. In early May, he wrote her a long message, without complaints or demands. He said he realized his mistakes, asked for forgiveness, and begged for one last meeting. "I just want to explain everything. No pressure, just once, please." Kimberly hesitated. Her close friend said she didn't want to go, but she still had doubts. On May 9, she sent a voice message. He's asking to meet again. He says it will be the last time, that he understands everything. I don't know. Maybe I should just end it. Her friend replied that she should be careful. Kimberly wrote back, I understand. I'll just talk to him. That's all. On the evening of May 10, she sent her mother a short message. Mom, I'm at Raphael's today. Everything's fine. Don't worry. This was nothing unusual. They knew who Raphael was and that he had been her boyfriend until recently. Even despite their recent breakup, the family did not feel alarmed. Her mother wished her a good evening and put down her phone. At 7:43 p.m., Kimberly sent her friend a final message. If I don't get in touch, he's convinced me again. Just kidding, of course. Everything will be fine. Since then, the phone has been silent. On the morning of May 11, her mother tried to contact her daughter. The calls went through, but no one answered. At first, this caused slight concern, but by noon it became clear that something was wrong. Kimberly always let her know if she was going to be late. She never left her phone off. By the evening of May 11, her parents arrived in Manaus and headed to her apartment. The door was locked and there were no lights on inside. Neighbors said they hadn't seen her since the previous day. She didn't show up for class. Her social media accounts remained inactive. Kimberly's mother filed a missing person report. The next day, the police began a search. No one had yet uttered the word crime. Everyone hoped that the girl had simply left, was tired, and had decided to disappear for a day. But with every passing minute, it became clear that she had not disappeared. She was somewhere. No one just knew where. May 11, 2020 began like any other Monday, but for Kimberly's family, it seemed strange from the very first hours. Her mother, having received no messages or answers to her calls in the morning, sensed something that defied logic. For the past 2 years, Kimberly had been living on her own in Manaus and had never left her family without a word. She wrote almost every day, briefly but regularly, how her day had gone, how her studies were going, what she had planned for tomorrow. And now, not a word, not a sound. Saturday passed. Sunday passed. And now it was Monday. The phone was not turned off. Calls were coming in, but there was no answer. Closer to noon, her mother dialed again. Then she called Kimberly's friend, the one to whom her daughter had sent her last message the day before. She replied that she hadn't heard anything since morning. Then she tried to text her. Only a single message appeared, as if the phone was on but not receiving data. Her parents didn't wait. On the evening of May 11, they left Manacor and arrived in Manaus late that night. They went straight to Kimberly's apartment. The lights were off. They knocked, waited, talked to neighbors, but there was no sign of their daughter. The door was locked. The house was a typical 2-story building with an external entrance and simple metal doors. The neighbors hadn't noticed anything unusual. No screams, no noise, no strangers visiting. Someone recalled seeing her 2 days earlier. That was all. The trail ended there. Her parents filed an official missing person report. The police began gathering information. Their first step was to check her place of residence. The next day, May 12, officers from the Missing Persons Department returned to the address. They knocked on the door, questioned the neighbors again, and contacted the mobile phone operator to track the last signals from her phone. It had been turned off on the night of May 11. There was no data on her movements. Around noon, investigators contacted the building manager and gained access to the archive of CCTV footage from cameras installed at the entrance. Footage from May 10 at around 9:15 p.m. shows Kimberly entering the building with a man. The faces are difficult to make out, but the silhouette of the girl is recognizable. She is wearing a white blouse and dark jeans. The man is wearing a black t-shirt and a cap. After that, there is no footage of Kimberly leaving the building. Only the man, about 2.5 hours later, at 11:40 p.m. leaves alone. This was the first alarming sign. Investigators recorded the video fragment. noted the timestamps, and returned to the door of the apartment where, according to neighbors, the girl had entered. The door was closed, and there were no sounds from inside. With a warrant, police officers broke the lock. Inside it was quiet. The lights were off and the place seemed empty. The apartment had only 2 rooms, a living room combined with a kitchen and a small bedroom. There were no signs of a struggle in the hallway or kitchen area. Everything was in its place. A glass on the sink, a shirt thrown over the back of a chair, a charger in the outlet. But in the bedroom, the scene had changed. The body of a young woman was found near the bed. It was lying partly on the floor and partly on the rug, with its back to the wall. The body had multiple injuries, visually identified as stab wounds. Next to it was a blanket, as if thrown on top in a hurry. Under the bed, wrapped in a kitchen towel, a kitchen knife with a wooden handle was found. There were brown marks on the floor and similar marks on the door handle. Whether the items in the room were not scattered. The window was closed, the curtains drawn. On the bedside table was a medical book, glasses, and next to it a woman's handbag. But there was no phone inside. Investigators carefully examined the scene. They noted that the door had not been broken down, the lock was intact, and there were no signs of forced entry. This suggested that the girl had entered the apartment of her own free will and knew where she was going. A preliminary examination of the body showed that death had most likely occurred on the night of May 10/11. The condition of the body was consistent with this time frame. A knife, a towel, pieces of fabric from the floor, and samples from the door handles were seized. All these items were sent to the forensic laboratory. Fingerprints from the knife and door handle were sent for examination. In addition to the body and the knife, a small gold pendant on a chain was found in the room. It was lying at the edge of the bed, as if it had been torn off. Kimberly's mother later confirmed that it was a birthday present. She wore it almost every day. The police immediately began to establish the identity of the man who had entered the house with her. No name has been released yet. The cameras did not provide clear images, and at this stage, no one has been officially named as a suspect. Investigators worked methodically, reconstructing Kimberly's movements over the past 2 days. It was established that on May 10, she did indeed text her mother that she was on her way to see a friend. Later, her friend showed the correspondence where Kimberly refers to him by name, Raphael. In the messages, she mentions that she is planning a short meeting with no further plans, just for a quiet chat. No traces of other people's presence were found in the apartment. There were no clues indicating a break-in or outside interference. All items were in their places. Detailed data from the camera confirmed that after 11:40 p.m., no one else left the apartment. According to the recording, Raphael left the building alone. At this stage, the investigation was dealing with the fact of death. The crime scene was secured. The cause of death was preliminarily established as multiple injuries. Evidence was collected. The camera footage was partially restored. The name of the man with whom she had entered the apartment had not yet been officially released. The investigation was just beginning. There were many questions. Where was her phone? Why didn't the neighbors hear anything? Why didn't anyone call the police, even though it was late? Who exactly was with her in the apartment during those 2.5 hours, and where did he go? From that moment on, the investigation moved on to the next stage, reconstructing Kimberly's last day and finding out who was with her at that moment. After Kimberly Karen Mota de Oliveira's body was found in an apartment in downtown Manaus, the investigation moved into the next phase. The circumstances of her death were already clear. The girl did not take her own life, and she was not alone in the apartment where she was found. But it was still unclear who was with her that evening and what exactly happened during the 2 hours between her arrival and the moment when the cameras recorded a man leaving the house alone. Most importantly, there were no official charges. A reconstruction of events was needed, based not on guesswork, but on a chain of facts. Investigators started with the basics. Her phone. It wasn't with Kimberly. Her bag was in the bedroom, but her mobile device was gone. The first theory was that someone had taken it to hide information. This wasn't unusual. Smartphones are often where people keep a record of their last few hours. Digital forensics experts requested data from the mobile operator to track the last signal. According to this data, the phone was turned off in the area of Rua Pedro Batista, about 600 meters from the crime scene. This led investigators to believe that the device might have been discarded. The next day, operatives searched trash cans in the area. In one of the bins, wrapped in a bundle of paper towels, they found a smartphone that looked like Kimberly's. It was in working order, but had been reset to factory settings. Nevertheless, forensic experts managed to extract the SIM card and, using special software, recover some of the deleted messages, backups, and chats. From the WhatsApp correspondence, partially restored using cloud data, investigators learned that on the eve of the meeting, Kimberly had written the following to her friend. "He's insisting again. He says he just needs to explain himself. I don't want to, but I'm afraid he'll come over." A few days earlier, she mentioned that she was trying to avoid contact. "I deleted his number. He's threatening to find me at school. I'm tired." These messages did not mention any names directly, but in a conversation with her friend, the phrase, "he says he'll change everything, Rafael just doesn't understand that it's over," appeared. The friend later confirmed that she was talking about Rafael Fernandez Rodriguez. At the same time, investigators analyzed CCTV footage. In addition to the recording from the entrance to the building where she was seen on the evening of May 10, investigators examined other footage from nearby intersections, bus stops, and streets. One of the cameras captured the moment when the same man, presumably Rafael, leaves the building, turns around, and heads toward the main street. A few minutes later, another fragment shows him on the other side of the block. He is not using transportation but walking. This confirmed that he left the apartment without Kimberly late at night and apparently took her phone with him. The next important part of the investigation was interviewing the neighbors. On the first day, immediately after the body was discovered, no one reported any unusual noises or strange sounds. But 2 days later, one of the residents of the building, an elderly man who lived one floor below, contacted the police. He said that on the night of May 12, at around 10:30 p.m., he heard a woman's voice. He did not remember the words, but the tone seemed alarming to him. Another witness, a middle-aged woman who lived next door, gave a more detailed account. She heard a phrase that, according to her, she still cannot forget. "You have no right." It sounded sharp, as if in the heat of an argument. After that, there was silence. She did not call the police that night because she did not hear anything else and decided it was just a normal argument. These details allowed investigators to establish a preliminary timeline. Kimberly entered the building at around 9:15 p.m. According to neighbors, the argument took place at around 10:30 p.m. The man leaves alone at 11:40 p.m. Between these moments, something happened that led to her death. Based on a time analysis, experts made a preliminary conclusion that the actions that led to the tragedy took place between approximately 10:15 p.m. and 11:00 p.m. At the same time, forensic experts analyzed the contents of the apartment. Fingerprints taken from the knife and the inside of the bedroom door handle were sent to the database. A day later, experts confirmed that the fingerprints matched those of Rafael Fernandez Rodriguez, which had already been registered in the database in connection with the processing of documents and passport data. At this stage, despite a wealth of circumstantial evidence, the investigation had not yet brought any formal charges. There was still no direct evidence of intent to cause harm. However, the nature of the evidence, the behavior of the alleged perpetrator, the deleted messages, and the phone found at the scene all pointed to the fact that the meeting that ended in tragedy was not spontaneous. After she left, Rafael did not go to the police or tell his family or neighbors that Kimberly might have left the apartment. He simply disappeared. The disappearance of the person with whom she had last been seen aroused the logical interest of the investigators. Later, a neighbor from the gym was interviewed who recognized Rafael from the description. She confirmed that he had previously exhibited obsessive behavior, was controlling, often asked other girls about their personal lives, and offered help that sometimes seemed inappropriate. All of this painted a picture of a man who wanted to control relationships and was afraid of losing control. The police did not make any premature statements. The suspect's name did not appear in the media or in official comments. But within the investigation team, they understood that the chain of evidence was forming a clear picture. The next step was to find Raphael and question him. Until then, everything remained within the realm of speculation, albeit increasingly well-founded. At this stage, the investigation focused on finding the man who, according to all the evidence, had been with Kimberly on the day of her disappearance. His whereabouts were unknown. Contact with him was lost that same night. His phone was off, and he did not show up at work. There was only one goal left: to find him. 3 days after the tragedy, on May 15, 2020, investigators officially identified the man with whom Kimberly Karen Mota de Oliveira spent her last evening. He was Rafael Fernandez Rodriguez, a 31-year-old resident of Manaus who had previously worked at a fitness center near the university where Kimberly studied. His name had already been mentioned several times in his girlfriend's testimony, and now, with the help of surveillance camera footage, digital evidence, and fingerprints, it became clear that he was the one who accompanied her that evening and then left the house alone 2.5 hours later. By the time the police arrived at his home, Rafael had already disappeared. The apartment where the crime took place belonged to him. He had moved out the day before the investigation team arrived, leaving behind only items of no value. His cell phone was turned off, and his social media accounts had been either deleted or deactivated. According to investigators, all these actions indicated that he was deliberately trying to conceal his whereabouts. Moreover, in the first 24 hours after his disappearance, he withdrew some money from his bank account and then bought a bus ticket to the city of Porto Velho in the neighboring state of Rondônia. Using footage from a camera that recorded his departure from the bus station in Manaus, the police began tracking his movements through regional terminals. However, Rafael, realizing that he might be under surveillance, avoided large transfer hubs and tried to change routes. His final destination, as it later turned out, was the city of Paracatu in the state of Minas Gerais, about 2,000 kilometers from Manaus. He had distant relatives living there, with whom, according to operational data, he hoped to find temporary refuge. On the morning of May 15, at the Paracatu intercity bus station, federal police officers who had received a tip the day before detained a man who identified himself as Mateus Ferreira. He had a fake document with that name on it, as well as a travel backpack containing a change of clothes, an ATM card, a SIM card without an active number, and several handwritten notes with addresses, phone numbers, and routes. He did not resist arrest. After his fingerprints were checked, his identity was confirmed. During his transfer to the police station, Rafael Fernandez Rodriguez initially refused to make a statement. However, after consulting with a lawyer a few hours later, he agreed to undergo preliminary questioning. His first words were, "I just wanted to talk. I didn't want it to end like this." He claimed that the meeting with Kimberly was initiated with the aim of reconciliation, that they talked, argued a little, and then everything got out of control. However, he did not answer the question of why he left the apartment alone and did not inform anyone about her condition. The Amazonas State Prosecutor's Office has formally charged him with a crime punishable by death for intentional homicide. Aggravating circumstances include his close relationship with the victim and his attempt to cover up the crime, including destroying personal data and fleeing the scene. The indictment specifically states that the crime was committed in the context of an interpersonal conflict against a backdrop of control and psychological pressure, which is a typical feature of so-called femicide, a crime in which a woman is killed by a former or current partner. At a press conference held that evening, a police representative stated, "We have confirmation that he accompanied the victim on the last day of her life, was alone with her in the apartment, and that it was after this event that she stopped communicating. The evidence points to his involvement, and his behavior after the incident confirms his intention to avoid responsibility. After his arrest, Rafael was placed in a detention center in Belo Horizonte awaiting transfer back to the state of Amazonas. Local authorities acted quickly. His status was changed to suspect, then to defendant, with formal charges and detention without bail. For the investigation, his capture was a turning point. Now they had not only a bunch of indirect evidence, but also the guy himself, whose behavior backed up the story that he was involved. Even though he had the formal right to a defense and was presumed innocent, the investigation was already shaping up into a logical story. There were weeks left before the trial, but in the public, in the press, and on social media, the name Rafael Fernandez Rodriguez had already become firmly established in people's minds as the name of the man with whom Kimberly had spent her last evening. The trial for the murder of Kimberly Karen Mota de Oliveira began in June 2020 in the Criminal Court of Manaus, the capital of the state of Amazonas. The defendant was Rafael Fernandez Rodriguez, the victim's 31-year-old ex-boyfriend. The prosecution's case was based on a combination of direct and circumstantial evidence gathered during the investigation and was accompanied by intense public and media attention. This was not just a private trial. In the eyes of many, it became a symbol of a broader problem that was increasingly being discussed openly in Brazil. The trial was conducted under the Brazilian Criminal Code, with a judge, prosecutor, defense team, and limited public access. The hearings were held with limited access due to health restrictions imposed in response to the pandemic. Despite this, every day of the trial was covered in local news, and brief excerpts from the statements of lawyers and investigators were widely discussed on social media. The prosecution presented the court with extensive evidence gathered during the investigation. This included surveillance camera footage showing Kimberly and Rafael entering the building on May 10, and Rafael leaving alone 2.5 hours later. Expert reports were presented. His fingerprints found on the knife and other items in the apartment, biological traces, reconstructed messages confirming that Kimberly was afraid of this meeting, data from a phone found, reset, and discarded near the scene of the crime. The forensic psychiatric report attracted particular attention. Rafael underwent a full diagnostic evaluation as part of the investigation, and experts concluded that at the time of the incident, he was of sound mind, aware of his actions, and did not suffer from any mental disorders. He understood what he was doing and consciously tried to cover his tracks. This detail became key in the prosecutor's counter-argument to the defense's claim of temporary loss of control. Rafael's lawyers tried to portray the crime as a tragedy committed in the heat of the moment, against a backdrop of emotional stress caused by a final breakup. They emphasized that the meeting was allegedly prearranged and that Rafael did not plan to cause harm. However, the court did not accept this line of defense, stating that the defendant's actions after the incident, deleting data, fleeing using fake documents, indicated an intention to avoid responsibility, rather than a sudden emotional breakdown. Several witnesses testified during the trial. Kimberly's friend, with whom she had been corresponding on the eve of the meeting, neighbors who heard the argument that night, and police officers involved in the investigation. The judge also heard from representatives of the digital forensics lab, who confirmed that the messages and data retrieved from the phone had been properly restored and were authentic. In his closing statement, the prosecutor said, "This girl did not die by accident. She died at the hands of a man she once trusted. He robbed her of her future and then tried to rob her of her voice by destroying everything that could tell the story of her last hours." Rafael himself behaved reservedly in court, avoiding direct eye contact with the victim's family. When asked by the judge if he admitted his guilt, he replied evasively, "I didn't want this to happen. I didn't think," and fell silent. His defense insisted on his right not to give detailed testimony. On September 17, 2020, the Court of First Instance in Manaus found Rafael Fernandez Rodriguez guilty of intentional murder with aggravating circumstances. On September 21, 2020, he was sentenced to 29 years in a maximum security prison. Ildiko Kradniak was born on August 14, 1969, in Szeged, a city in southern Hungary near the border with Serbia. Her family was intelligent and modest. Her father taught mathematics at a technical college, and her mother worked as a nurse. Her parents instilled in their daughter a strong work ethic, respect for knowledge, and a desire for independence. From childhood, Ildiko was distinguished by her diligence, interest in the natural sciences, and dreaminess, which she expressed through drawing, cosmetics, and language study. At school, she was known as the Little Diplomat for her gentle nature, careful choice of words, and ability to resolve conflicts between her peers. By the time she finished high school, she was already fluent in English and wanted to pursue a career in aesthetics and body care. Inspired by her mother's stories about medicine and the human body, she enrolled in a local medical school, specializing in physical therapy and dermatological cosmetology. In the early 1990s, after the fall of socialism, Ildiko moved to the United States on an education and employment visa. She first settled in Chicago, but after a few years moved to California, seeking a warmer climate and opportunities in the beauty industry. There, she obtained her cosmetology license, began working in salons, and eventually gained a reputation as a specialist with a feel for skin. By the mid-2000s, she had an established clientele, a portfolio that included treatments for celebrities and recognition among her peers. In 2012, she opened her own salon in Aliso Viejo, a small office on the first floor of an office building where women came every day for care, relaxation, and confidential conversation. Ildiko created an atmosphere of care and comfort around her. Clients often called her a psychologist with a mask in her hands. She knew how to listen, remember details, and offer support. Stephen Beale came into her life in the mid-2010s. He was a few years older, charismatic, intelligent, and interested in engineering projects, model rockets, and pyrotechnics. They met at a charity event held at a local art gallery. Stephen, who had been widowed in 2008, seemed charming and attentive. Ildiko was attracted by his neatness, his ability to speak to the point, and his interest in culture. Their relationship developed slowly but steadily. He helped her with interior repairs, accompanied her on trips, and showed her his model engine assembly projects. She supported him when he was undergoing treatment for the effects of chemicals used in his hobby. But over the years, according to friends, friction began to arise in their relationship. Jealousy, control, and differences in outlook. Ildiko became more independent, planning trips without him and discussing expanding the business. Despite the complexity of their relationship, their union lasted several years. They were not officially married, but they lived as a couple. And according to acquaintances, Stephen was emotionally dependent on her, although outwardly everything looked quite respectable. May 15, 2018 was no different from any other day. The morning was sunny. Ildiko arrived at the salon a little earlier than usual, parked her white Audi, walked through the glass doors and, as always, turned on the lights and the music player. The first clients began to arrive around 11 o'clock. The procedures went on as usual. That same morning, she received a small package. According to eyewitnesses, the box was unremarkable, neutral in color with no bright markings addressed to her personally. She brought it to her office, placed it on the table, and apparently decided to open it during a short break between appointments. At 1:00 p.m., when two other clients were still in the room, there was a loud bang. The building shook from the explosion. The walls shook and glass flew everywhere. In a matter of seconds, the room was filled with dust and smoke. Neighboring offices were evacuated. Firefighters, police, and paramedics arrived at the scene. The area was cordoned off. A woman at the entrance described what happened as an explosion that rang in my ears. Two victims were rushed to the hospital. Ildiko Kradniak, who was closest to the source of the explosion, died at the scene. Initially, it was assumed that the cause could have been a domestic accident, faulty equipment, a gas cylinder, or a short circuit. But the nature of the destruction, the smell in the air, and the characteristics of the damage suggested otherwise. This was no accident. Someone had sent an explosive device, and while the streets of Aliso Viejo were still ringing with sirens, work began in the corridors of federal agencies, cautious, methodical, and long. The investigation was just beginning. On that May day, nothing foreshadowed disaster. Until lunchtime, Ildiko Kraniak's salon was operating as usual. Pleasant music, the smell of eucalyptus, appointments for treatments, clients coming in for hair care, massages, and confidential conversations. The office was cozy and well kept, reflecting the character of its owner, precise, calm, and confident. But all that disappeared in an instant when, around 1 p.m., the room shook from a loud bang. The explosion disrupted not only the silence, but also the very fabric of everyday life. Plaster flew off the walls, shards of glass rained down from the display cases, and alarms screeched inside. In a matter of seconds, the salon was filled with smoke and dust. People from neighboring offices rushed out into the street. 5 minutes later, Marableu Street was already blocked off. First ambulances arrived, then the police and firefighters. There were 3 victims. 2 women survived with injuries of varying severity. The owner of the salon, Ildiko, who was closest to the source of the explosion, died at the scene. Initially, the accident was thought to be accidental, possibly faulty equipment, overheated oil, or a short circuit. However, as experts arrived, it became clear that the destruction was deliberate. Firefighters inspected the interior and found that the explosion did not come from outside. It occurred inside, near a table where a small box was standing. The plastic was torn apart, parts of the case were scattered within a radius of several meters, and burn marks were visible on the ceiling in some places. This indicated that a component with a high combustion temperature had been used. 2 hours after the incident, representatives of the Federal Bureau of Investigation and the Bureau of Alcohol, Tobacco, Firearms, and Explosives, ATF, joined the investigation. Even then, suspicion began to fall on internal rather than external causes. The processing of the scene began. Forensic experts used tongs, brushes, and special analyzers to ensure that no fragment was overlooked. Numerous metal parts were found on the floor, some of them partially burned and melted. One of the clients, who was able to give a brief statement, mentioned that shortly before the explosion, Ildiko had brought a package to the office, an ordinary cardboard box, probably received through the postal service. She did not have the slightest suspicion, neither about its weight, appearance, nor smell, and yet it was this box that became the source of the tragedy. Fragments of the packaging found in different parts of the room underwent initial analysis. Traces of glue, metal particles, sharp elements, something like bearings or balls, were found on the inside of the box. Experts later confirmed that the device was homemade, designed and assembled by hand. It included a lithium battery power supply, a detonation circuit, probably via a contact detonator, and striking elements typical of unauthorized pyrotechnics. A rare component was used as an explosive, leaving bright orange traces on the nearest walls and furniture. Chemical analysis revealed a substance that is not used for domestic purposes, but is found in incendiary mixtures and rocket propellants. This discovery proved to be crucial. This chemical is not sold in regular stores. It is difficult to obtain without specific knowledge or connections. This substance is typically used by people involved in technical modeling, fireworks, or industrial pyrotechnics. This feature instantly narrowed down the circle of suspects. It was not just a question of who might have wanted to cause harm, but who had the technical ability to assemble such a device. In addition, everything pointed to the fact that the perpetrator knew that Ildiko would be there at that exact moment. The package was not sent to her home address or at a random time. It was timed for a workday when she would be there in person. This meant one thing. Someone knew her schedule, habits, and routine. Investigators questioned the Postal Service employees who served the building to determine how exactly the package had arrived and at what stage it could have been replaced or planted. CCTV footage was seized. It was established that the box had been delivered by a courier service at around 10:45 a.m. and left at the reception desk of the office complex. According to the administrator, it was indeed signed for by Ildiko, with no indication of the sender, just her name and office number. This was another important detail. The perpetrator took care not to attract attention with either the packaging or the delivery method. Meanwhile, ATF laboratories and FBI experts were reconstructing the device. The assembled components indicated a high level of preparation. For example, the wire connections were neatly made using epoxy resin and heat-shrink tubing. The batteries were reliable with a good service life. This suggested that the device was not designed to detonate spontaneously, but to be triggered at a specific time. Forensic experts recreated the bomb's outline on a 3D model and concluded that it was activated when the lid was opened, causing a short circuit through the built-in circuit board. This meant that whoever sent the package expected it to be opened by the addressee. A piece of paper with a partial fingerprint was also found. It was sent to a federal database for identification. There were no results yet, but the fact that there was a fingerprint strengthened the investigators' position. The device had been assembled by hand, and this could have been a trace from one of the stages of manufacture. Meanwhile, research was being conducted on the substance. The orange powder. Chemists confirmed that the compound was unstable, dangerous when heated, and required protective equipment and expertise. Its use outside of a manufacturing environment was virtually impossible without specialized training. At this stage, investigators already understood that the perpetrator was not only technically skilled, but also had access to information about the victim. It could not have been a coincidence that the explosive device arrived on the day when Ildiko was working without an assistant. She usually had fewer clients on Tuesdays and sometimes remained alone in the office. The investigation checked internal connections, former employees, partners, clients, acquaintances. A list of people who had access to her schedule began to take shape. Investigators also noticed the absence of cameras in the office itself. This complicated the task. However, external cameras captured something interesting. Several days before the incident, a dark-colored SUV appeared repeatedly in the area near the office, stopping in the parking lot closer to the building. Its license plate number was partially deciphered. A check of the databases showed a match with a car registered to a man who had previously been in a relationship with Ildiko. At that point, it was just a thread, but an important one. The pieces gathered, the device, the rare materials, the precision of the execution, the knowledge of the schedule, all pointed to a carefully planned crime. This was not a spur-of-the-moment decision or an emotional outburst. It was calculated. That is why the investigation could not afford to rush. Every step had to be checked, every piece of evidence confirmed from different angles. The question was not only who did it, but also why. The investigation that followed the explosion became one of the most complex and sensitive operations in Orange County in recent years. In the days following the tragedy, investigators focused on reconstructing the chain of events, analyzing evidence, and studying the victim's lifestyle. As these pieces began to fit together, a man emerged from the background, whose name was mentioned more and more often in conversations with Ildiko's friends and family, but who, at first, was not considered a suspect in the crime. He was Ildiko's former partner, a man with whom she had more than just a relationship. Their relationship had lasted several years. They traveled together, attended events, and made plans for the future, but, according to her friends, it ended badly. The breakup occurred a few months before the tragedy and, according to some of her friends, was accompanied by emotional scenes, unspoken words, and moments of anxiety. Ildiko could not stand conflict, but in recent months she had reportedly been feeling increasing pressure from whom no one specified at the time. When investigators began analyzing her digital devices, her phone, laptop, and cloud services, they found messages and notes in which she mentioned tense conversations with her former partner, concerns about his excessive interest in her movements, the appearance of unsigned messages, and even a feeling of being followed. Although she never reported the threats officially, the tone of her notes, especially those made in March and April, gave investigators the strong impression that Ildiko was feeling psychological pressure but did not want to involve the police. This information was not conclusive, but it did provide a lead. It revealed a name that had not previously been linked to the incident. It was then that investigators turned their attention to surveillance camera footage from the office building where the salon was located. Several days before the tragedy, on May 9, 10, and 11, a car matching Stephen Beal's description was spotted near the entrance to the building. The camera captured an SUV parked where Ildiko's Audi usually stood. Neither the driver nor the passengers were clearly visible in the recording, but analysis of the license plate, even partially illuminated, identified it as belonging to Stephen. This fact became the first material lead. Unconfirmed but significant. Was he in the car? Why was he at her office? Was it a coincidence? The police requested a warrant for temporary access to his GPS navigation data and, within the limits of the law, for information from his phone and laptop. Once they got the go-ahead, investigators took Stephen Beal's electronic devices for analysis. At the same time, on May 18, his house in Long Beach was searched. FBI, ATF, and local police were involved. They started with his workshop and garage. Inside the rooms used to assemble model rockets, the investigation was already aware of his hobby. Chemicals, plastic containers, diagrams, and electrical circuit parts were found. At first glance, nothing illegal. Everything could be explained by his hobby. He was indeed involved in building model engines, participated in exhibitions, and communicated on technical forums. However, according to ATF experts, some of the materials found in his storage room matched the composition of those used in the homemade device that exploded in the cabin. For example, a small plastic container was seized, the inside of which had traces of the same orange substance. Rolls of wiring were also found that matched the color, thickness, and type of insulation found at the scene. A sealed bottle marked, "For experiments, do not touch," was found in the chemical storage box, in which experts later identified peroxide compounds suitable for creating unstable mixtures. However, all this remained circumstantial. None of the substances were illegal in themselves. None of the items contained any obvious signs linking them to a specific parcel. There were no fingerprints on the bomb, nor was there any direct evidence that he had sent the box. But the combination of these factors, the chemical components, the technical knowledge, the personal proximity to the victim, the confirmed presence at her office a few days before the incident, and the messages with alarming hints, began to form a coherent picture. A psychologist brought in to assist with the investigation described the possible profile of the perpetrator as technically competent, rational, but emotionally unstable and prone to control. This portrait matched the traits described by Ildiko's friends when talking about her former partner. Meanwhile, the lab kept analyzing the clues found in the wreckage. One of the experts noticed how the wires were connected in the device, an unusual use of a thin layer of epoxy resin and specific clips to hold the joints together. This technique was rare and not typical for most homemade devices. When photographs of the samples from Beal's home were compared with elements of the bomb's design, several similarities were found in the assembly method, including a characteristic mark left by the soldering tool used. In addition, experts found rough sketches on Beal's tablet, presumably made several weeks before the incident. One of them showed a model of a box-shaped device with a detonator, labeled "Prototype, Do Not Activate, Test." It was not identical to the bomb's design, but it used the same principles: a cover, a contact switch, a battery, and a switch. All this still did not allow for an indictment. However, internal reports from the investigation team already indicated that Stephen Beal was a key figure of interest. Investigators did not name him as a suspect, arrest him, or question him with a view to pressing charges. But his name was everywhere, in the file, in the chains of analysis, in the team's brainstorming sessions. It was during this period, about a week after the tragedy, that investigators began to realize that more than coincidences were needed to obtain full confirmation of his involvement. They needed certainty, which could be provided by either a fingerprint, a digital trace, or a confession. The work was just beginning, and new units were joining the investigation. Ahead lay painstaking work on the details, matching dates, routes, chemistry, psychology, and most importantly, finding the link that would tie everything together into an unbreakable chain. The investigation had reached the point where there was no longer any doubt. Everything that had previously seemed like a series of coincidences, the chemicals in the house, the old diagrams, the strange routes, now had a precise, scientifically proven explanation. Laboratory analysis showed that the composition of the lead compound found at the scene of the explosion was identical to the substance stored in Stephen Beale's workshop. The samples were compared on dozens of parameters, from the level of purification and molecular structure to micro traces characteristic of a specific production batch. Moreover, the identity of the microimpurities in both substances allowed investigators to conclude that these were not just similar compounds, but material from the same source. Such a result could not be explained by chance. At this stage, investigators delved deeper into the digital trail. Several technical files were extracted from Stephen's laptop. Among them were diagrams and drawings of devices that included timers, contact detonators, battery packs, and mechanical pressure activation elements. One of the documents, created several weeks before the tragedy, was a drawing that used the same components found at the scene: a plastic case, batteries, a connecting board, and a switch that activated when the cover was lifted. Formally, this could have been just an engineering sketch, but in essence it practically replicated the structure of the real device that went off in the cabin. Purchase data provided additional confirmation. Through financial documents, investigators discovered 2 orders placed by Stephen Bill on a specialized website of a pyrotechnics company in Virginia. The order was placed in April, a month before the explosion. The invoice listed orange substance 500 grams, technical cleaning. The delivery address matched the address of his workshop. Stephen used his name and corporate email address, registered during his consulting days, to place the order. This was not just an indirect hint, but a concrete document proving that he had access to the material used in the device. However, the most significant find was a fingerprint. One of the burnt fragments of the inner packaging delivered to the FBI laboratory contained a partially preserved fingerprint. It took several days to reconstruct it. Using chemical treatment, digital modeling, and layering, the fingerprint structure was restored. After checking the federal database, it became clear that the fingerprint belonged to Stephen Beale. It had been taken earlier, in 2011, when he registered as a participant in an engineering festival related to experimental technology. This coincidence became a critical element. Now the investigation had not only a motive, not only the technical capability, not only a personal connection to the victim, but also physical evidence linked to the crime scene. On May 24, 2018, at 6:40 a.m., ATF agents and county police officers arrived at a house on a quiet street in Long Beach. Stephen Beale was at home. The arrest went smoothly, without resistance. He was informed that he was being detained on suspicion of possessing explosives without the proper permits. This was a legally valid basis for holding him in custody until all procedures were completed. At the time of his arrest, he had not yet been charged with murder, but investigators already knew that it was only a matter of time. In the days that followed, the prosecutor's office, together with federal agencies, completed the indictment. The charges included several counts: intentional use of an explosive device resulting in death, attempted harm to others, and illegal possession of components of an explosive device. Everything that had previously been part of a hypothesis was now official. Every piece of evidence, chemical, digital, documentary, and fingerprint, corroborated the version that investigators had been pursuing from day one. The explosion in the car was not an accident, but the result of a precise, cold-blooded calculation by someone who knew the victim, her routine, her lifestyle, and her character. Now, Bill was no longer just Ildiko's former partner. He was the accused, and he was facing trial. The trial for the explosion in Ildiko Krajniak's salon became one of the most high-profile cases in Orange County in recent years. The case was heard in the U.S. District Court for the Central District of California in Santa Ana. The defendant was Stephen Beal, 64, a former engineer with no previous criminal record, who was into technical modeling and had been in a close relationship with the victim. The indictment was based on 4 main counts: attempted use of an explosive device resulting in death, attempted harm to others, unlawful possession of explosives, and use of a weapon of mass destruction. The hearings began in mid-2022. The trial itself lasted more than 2 years, with several breaks due to the complexity of the case, the large volume of evidence, and the need for additional technical expertise. The court hearings were accompanied by strict security measures. Representatives of federal agencies, witnesses, experts, and relatives of the victim and the defendant were present. The media, in turn, followed every stage, but most of the details, especially those concerning the nature of the device and its chemical composition, were not disclosed in full given their sensitivity. The prosecution relied on a comprehensive body of evidence, including physical evidence, digital traces, eyewitness testimony, and laboratory test results. The following points were key: the identity of the chemicals found on the defendant and at the crime scene, documents confirming the purchase of rare pyrotechnic components, electronic drawings of devices corresponding to the design of the explosion, a fingerprint on the inside of the packaging, and video footage showing Stephen's car near Ildiko's office a few days before the tragedy. The court paid particular attention to the psychological aspects of the case. Witnesses were heard, Ildiko's friends and colleagues, as well as members of her family, who reported that in the last months of her life she had been experiencing stress and tension related to her former partner. Excerpts from her personal correspondence were read out, in which she mentioned feeling watched and under emotional pressure. Although there were no direct threats in the messages, the context of the communication and the tone of the letters indicated an unstable dynamic between her and Stephen after their breakup. The defense, in turn, insisted that there was no direct intent. The lawyers argued that the technical materials found in Stephen's home were part of his hobby, and the presence of rare chemicals and diagrams did not prove his guilt. The defense emphasized that their client was a man immersed in technical experiments, passionate about engineering, and had never shown any tendency toward aggression. According to their version, the fingerprint could have gotten on the packaging accidentally while the materials were being stored. However, under the weight of systematically constructed evidence, this version gradually lost strength. The prosecution presented a complete chronological analysis, from the moment the chemicals were purchased to the shipment of the package, the route it took, the time it arrived at the office, and the moment it was opened. A comprehensive reconstruction showed that the device could not have been assembled without a precise understanding of the mechanics and knowledge of how and when the victim would come into contact with the parcel. Experts confirmed that the short circuit occurred when the lid was lifted, a detail requiring precision, and it was precisely this diagram that was found on the defendant's computer. The court heard more than 20 witnesses, including explosives experts, technical consultants, forensic scientists, and postal and courier service employees. Each testimony reinforced the main line of the prosecution. The crime was planned, carried out by a person with technical skills, and directed specifically at one victim. The sentencing hearing took place in January 2025. District Court Judge Josephine Staton delivered the closing remarks. In her speech, she emphasized that the evidence presented by the prosecution formed a continuous chain with no links of chance. She noted that the crime was calculated and deliberate, and that its consequences were devastating not only for the victim, but also for everyone who happened to be nearby. On January 19, 2025, the U.S. District Court for the Central District of California found Stephen Beal guilty of intentionally using an explosive device, resulting in death, attempted murder, and unlawful possession of components classified as weapons of mass destruction. On January 23, 2025, he was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole, and an additional 30 years for the charges he faced. Gail Brink was born in 1965 in a small town near Holland, Michigan. She was the third child and only daughter in the Weingarten family. Her parents, Thomas and Martha Weingarten, always paid special attention to raising their children, striving to give them the opportunity to develop and build their lives in a stable, supportive environment. Thomas worked as an engineer at a local factory, while Martha was a homemaker who also worked part-time at the school library. From childhood, Gail stood out for her determination and love of learning. She attended Holland High School and quickly gained a reputation as a diligent student with a strong character. She was interested in literature and biology and was actively involved in school theater productions. Gail dreamed of becoming a nurse or a doctor, professions that she believed would allow her to help people and contribute to society. After graduating from high school, Gail enrolled in a nearby college to study nursing. There, she made many new friends and expanded her social circle. In her second year of college, fate brought her together with a young man named Rick Brink, an engineering student from a neighboring town. Rick Brink was born in 1957 in a small town near Holland, Michigan. From childhood, he showed an interest in science and technology, which set him apart from his peers. Rick was a diligent student in school, excelling in mathematics and physics. Thanks to his abilities and hard work, he was accepted into a technical institute, where he chose to study engineering. During his studies, he developed a keen interest in the latest technologies, which allowed him to successfully launch his professional career. After graduating from college, Rick got a job as an engineer at a local company, where he quickly earned the respect of his colleagues thanks to his hard work and calm, even-tempered nature. He was known for his ability to focus on tasks and find creative solutions to technical problems. This combination of professionalism and kindness made him a valuable employee and a pleasant person to work with. Rick and Gail were married in June 1985 in a small, cozy church not far from their hometowns. The ceremony was intimate, attended by a small circle of close relatives and loyal friends who came to share this important day with them. Gail looked like a real bride in an elegant white dress, with delicate makeup and a flower wreath in her hair. Her eyes sparkled with happiness and hope for a bright future. Rick, on the other hand, was calm and confident. He did not hide his joy and pride that they were now together. After the ceremony, the newlyweds held a small reception at the family home, where warm toasts were made, childhood stories were told, and dreams for the future were shared. Both were full of optimism. Gail was looking forward to finishing her studies and starting work, while Rick was eager to advance his career in engineering. The couple quickly set up their new home in Rick's house in the quiet neighborhood of Park Township. It was a small but cozy house with a garden where they saw a place for their future children and a happy family life. In the first months of their life together, the newlyweds often talked about their plans, traveling, starting a family, and building careers. Their love seemed strong and sincere, and their life full of possibilities and bright hope. Despite their youth, the marriage seemed strong and harmonious. Gail continued her studies and worked part-time at a local clinic to gain experience, while Rick built a career as an engineer, gaining more and more recognition at work. Their life together was typical of newlyweds, full of aspirations and the joys of their first years together. However, as is often the case in life, the outward harmony hid inner tensions. The Weingardens had old secrets that no one discussed openly, secrets that could destroy even the strongest relationships. One of those secrets concerned Gail herself. Almost 2 years had passed since the wedding, and on one spring evening in 1987, Rick and Gail's neighbor, an elderly woman named Mary Harris, noticed the unusual behavior of her neighbors. Usually at that time of the evening, the young couple's house was already immersed in silence and tranquility, the lights were off, and the street was gradually emptying. But on that day, the lights in their house were on much longer than usual, and this immediately caused Mary some slight concern. The evening silence that usually reigned in the Park Township neighborhood seemed to be broken by a strange aura. Mary remembered that she knew Rick and Gail as attentive and responsible neighbors who always kept things tidy and followed a daily routine. The lights in their house, burning so late, were not in keeping with their habits. The neighbor began to wonder what was going on inside. Deciding to check, Mary approached the door and knocked several times. There was no answer. She rang the doorbell, but again there was no response. The woman then tried to look through the windows, but the light from the interior made it impossible to see what was happening inside the rooms. There was complete silence. No sound of footsteps, no voices, no usual noise of life, which only increased her anxiety. Mary stood at the door for several minutes, trying to decide whether she should be concerned. She called the neighbors across the street to see if they had noticed anything unusual, but no one could provide any answers. With each passing moment, her doubts about Rick and Gail's well-being grew stronger. After a while, realizing that neither of them was going to open the door or answer the phone, Mary realized that something was clearly wrong. She couldn't understand how such a responsible and caring couple could simply ignore their neighbors or lock themselves in without explanation. She was overcome with anxiety and decided that she would not be able to figure out what was going on without outside help. After weighing everything, Mary dialed the police and reported her suspicions, saying that she had been unable to contact her neighbors for a long time and was concerned about their well-being. When the police arrived at the scene, they found Rick and Gail Brink's house in its usual condition. It stood in a quiet neighborhood in Park Township, surrounded by a small garden and a well-kept lawn. The patrol car stopped at the curb and two officers approached the house, cautiously assessing the situation. The lights were still on, illuminating the semi-darkness of the night. The house was unlocked. The front door was open, which aroused suspicion. It looked as if someone had left in a hurry, or conversely, was inviting them in. The officers cautiously crossed the threshold. A strange silence reigned inside. There was no familiar noise of everyday life, not even the sound of a clock or the quiet hum of ventilation. The first glance immediately drew attention to a small mess. Books were scattered on the floor near the door, household items were strewn about, and it seemed that someone had been in a hurry or had entered the house unexpectedly. The setting was typical of a young family. Furniture, photographs on the walls, dishes on the kitchen table. But the commotion in the interior made it clear that something unusual had happened here recently. Looking more closely, the police discovered two bodies lying motionless on the floor in the living room. They were Rick and Gail Brink. Their clothes were neat, but their faces were lifeless and their bodies motionless, leaving no doubt that they were dead. Investigators immediately began a thorough examination of Rick and Gail's bodies to determine the circumstances of their deaths. The first thing that caught their attention were the gunshot wounds. There were clear bullet holes in both bodies. These wounds had a distinctive appearance, smooth edges and neat holes, indicating that the bullets had been fired from close or medium range. The location of the wounds on the bodies indicated that the attack was sudden. The victims did not have time to defend themselves or resist. The wounds were fatal, and their nature left no doubt that a firearm was the primary weapon used in the crime. Investigators noted the absence of signs of a struggle or attempts to escape, which further supported the surprise nature of the attack. It was also noteworthy that the wounds were inflicted quickly and accurately, ruling out accident or incompetence. Everything pointed to a premeditated and brutal crime committed with cold calculation. After an initial examination of the bodies, investigators decided to send Rick and Gail's bodies for forensic examination. This was necessary to establish the exact circumstances of their deaths. Experts needed to identify any additional injuries that might not have been visible during the external examination. In addition, ballistic analysis was an important step in the investigation, involving the examination of bullets and gunshot wounds to determine the type of weapon, the range of the shots, and other details that could help solve the crime. The results of the analysis were expected to be key to further investigation and determining the circumstances of the tragedy. The police assumed that the incident could have been a robbery, as in such cases the victims often sustain injuries while resisting the criminals. However, after a thorough check, this assumption was quickly rejected. There were no signs of valuable items missing from the house. Money and documents remained in their places, and appliances and consumer electronics were also undamaged and had not been stolen. The investigation then considered the possibility that this could have been a planned attack, or, conversely, a crime committed in the heat of the moment without prior planning. A key factor in this was the fact that the doors of the house had not been broken or damaged. This meant that the perpetrator or perpetrators had gained access to the house without using force to break in, i.e., they had been let in by the owners themselves. Consequently, a stranger who was not familiar with the couple would not have been able to simply break in. This detail narrowed the circle of suspects considerably. Based on this, investigators concluded that the perpetrator was someone known to the couple, a friend, relative, or close acquaintance who was trusted and let in without suspicion. This conclusion greatly influenced the course of the investigation. In addition, the overall picture of the crime seemed too neat and professional to be an unplanned attack. There were no signs of a struggle, chaos, or panic, which usually accompany sudden attacks. Everything pointed to the fact that the perpetrator had prepared for this event in advance and acted according to a clear plan. Investigators concluded that this case could not be considered a simple robbery or a random act of violence. There was evidence of a carefully thought-out plan, which in turn pointed to a deep motive and serious reasons that drove the perpetrator to take such a radical step. So, a big forensic investigation started at the crime scene. Samples were collected, evidence was recorded, and possible witnesses and people close to the couple were interviewed. This place became not only the scene of a tragedy, but also the start of a long investigation that would try to solve the mystery of the young couple's death. After the police arrived at the crime scene and conducted an initial examination, thorough work began to record all the details and evidence. Rick and Gail's house was sealed off to keep out strangers and preserve the scene in its original state. The investigators understood that every little detail could be the key to solving the case. Forensic experts were called to the scene to take detailed photographs, collect fingerprints, and gather other physical evidence. This stage was critically important. Any mistakes here could ruin the entire investigation. At the same time, investigators began gathering information about the victims' lives and their surroundings. Neighbors, acquaintances, and relatives were interviewed. Special attention was immediately paid to Ryan Weingarten, Gail's brother, who had always been at the center of family conflicts and had a strained relationship with his relatives. His name came to the attention of the police for a reason. The doors of the house had not been broken into, which meant that the perpetrator was known to someone and trusted by the couple. This fact became one of the main leads in the investigation, and investigators assumed that the victims had let a familiar person into their home. It was logical to assume that the culprit was someone from their close circle. Family secrets, the complicated relationship between Ryan and Gail, and his ambiguous behavior made him the prime suspect. Ryan Weingarten was called in for questioning at the police station in the early days after the bodies of his sister Gail and her husband Rick Brink were found. During the interview, he strongly denied all suspicions against him. He confidently stated that he had no connection to the tragic events that took place in the couple's home. Moreover, Ryan did not shy away from criticizing the methods used by investigators in their inquiry. According to him, many of the police's actions were unprofessional and their conclusions were hasty and unfounded. He pointed to the lack of direct evidence linking him to the crime and emphasized that the charges were based solely on speculation and hearsay. Despite the emotional toll of the situation and the pressure he was under, Ryan remained calm and willing to cooperate with law enforcement within reason. He openly stated that he was not afraid to provide information that would help shed light on what had happened, but at the same time insisted that it was important not to jump to conclusions and not to cast suspicion on an innocent person without solid grounds. His position was clear and firm. He was confident in his innocence and wanted the investigation to be conducted objectively and fairly. without bias or emotional speculation. This interrogation became one of the key moments in the case, as it revealed the tense relationship between the accused and the investigators, while also highlighting the complexity of the situation in which the police found themselves, trying to find evidence in a difficult and confusing case. Despite these statements, the police lacked direct evidence to bring formal charges. The investigation faced a serious problem. Numerous pieces of circumstantial evidence could not replace evidence that would unequivocally point to the perpetrator. This created a difficult situation. On the one hand, there was a suspect with an obvious motive and opportunity. On the other, there was a lack of irrefutable facts. Meanwhile, forensic experts received the results of the ballistics examination. It was established that the shots were fired from a small-caliber pistol at close range. This pointed to a targeted killing. The shots were not spontaneous, but carefully aimed. This type of weapon is usually used in crimes where it is important to remain silent and accurate. This fact allowed investigators to rule out the possibility of an accidental conflict or an attack by a stranger. The medical examination added to the picture. No other injuries or signs of a struggle were found on Rick and Gail's bodies. This meant that the victims did not resist or were taken by surprise. This circumstance only reinforced the assumption that the perpetrator was known to them and did not arouse suspicion. All these details painted a certain picture in the minds of the investigators, a carefully planned crime committed by someone close to the victims. However, despite this, the police had no way of proving anyone's guilt beyond a reasonable doubt. The investigation continued, but with each passing day it became more difficult. Investigators were faced with a lack of new evidence, and numerous theories could not be confirmed. Interviews with neighbors, friends, and colleagues did not lead to any significant discoveries. None of the couple's relatives spoke openly about their motives or suspicions. Many closed themselves off, afraid of interfering in someone else's life, while others simply did not know anything new. The police carefully checked all the information they had received: who had last seen the couple and when, who might have had a motive for revenge, who was in conflict with them. But nothing could displace Ryan from the position of prime suspect. Meanwhile, the investigation gradually wound down. Due to a lack of new facts, the case of Rick and Gail's murder was frozen. The materials were neatly packed away, the case was archived, and for many years it became one of those tragic mysteries that never gets solved. Rumors and speculation continued to circulate, but for the police, it was a serious setback. The perpetrator remained at large, and the victims' families lived in anticipation of justice that never came. Many believed that the case would remain unsolved. However, new circumstances would emerge in the future that would allow the investigation to be reopened, and then the truth would come out. The murder of Rick and Gail Brink remained one of the most mysterious and difficult cases in the history of the local police. For many years, the investigation yielded no clear results, and investigators were constantly faced with dead ends. For a long time, there were no clear suspects, and the course of the investigation changed several times depending on new circumstances and emerging evidence. Initially, investigators considered various versions, ranging from a random robbery to an accidental attack, as well as versions involving other people close to the victims. Over the years, suspicion fell on neighbors and acquaintances of the couple, but none of the versions had sufficient evidence to proceed with charges. However, many years after the tragedy, the case took a new turn. During a review of the case files and taking into account new circumstances, information emerged that prompted investigators to take another look at Ryan Wingarden, Gail's brother. It became clear that motives that had previously been overlooked now took on much greater significance. One of the main motives was Ryan's envy of his brother and sister-in-law's success. The young couple's life seemed unattainable to him. Rick was building a career, had a stable income, and Gail was managing to balance her studies and work and seemed to be the embodiment of success and happiness. For Ryan, whose relationship with his family had always been strained, this caused deep inner irritation and perhaps even resentment. An additional and very serious factor that complicated the case and had a significant impact on the motivation for the crime was the information that Ryan and his sister Gail had been in an intimate relationship during their teenage years. This fact remained a carefully guarded family secret for a long time, which family members did not discuss openly and tried with all their might to cover up. They did not even talk about it outside the family, fearing the consequences, condemnation, and destruction of their reputation. Those who knew about this secret understood how much it could affect the lives of everyone involved. It was a topic that could cause deep emotional trauma and irreparable rifts within the family. It was precisely because of the fear of this information being revealed and the possibility of public condemnation that tension arose, which only grew over time. For Ryan, this secret became a heavy burden that he tried to hide by any means necessary. It was probably his desire to keep the secret and prevent its disclosure that became one of the reasons for his inner conflict and motivation for his cruel act. Perhaps he feared that his sister's success and happiness with her husband could lead to the disclosure of their relationship, which would destroy his life and jeopardize his reputation. Thus, the desire to keep the secret, hide the truth, and eliminate the threat of disclosure could have pushed Ryan to take tragic action. Investigators also noted that Ryan behaved extremely suspiciously during the period of the murders. His actions and behavior raised questions among both his loved ones and law enforcement officials. He avoided contact, changed his travel routes, and was overly cautious in his communications. This only served to heighten suspicions about him. Pam Weingarten, Ryan's wife, became a key figure in the further development of the investigation and ended up being the main witness for the prosecution. At the time of the crime, Pam was with Ryan and was able to closely observe his behavior and emotional state. Despite this, she remained silent for a long time, possibly out of fear, doubt, or a desire to protect her husband. However, years later, when the investigation was reopened and the pressure intensified, Pam decided to testify, which proved to be a turning point in the investigation. In her testimony, Pam described in detail the complex relationships within the Weingarten family, especially between Ryan and his sister Gail. She spoke of numerous arguments, tensions, and hidden conflicts that had built up over the years and were exacerbated by jealousy and resentment. According to her, Ryan repeatedly expressed dissatisfaction with his life, openly talking about his resentment toward his brother and sister-in-law, envying their success and family happiness. In addition, Pam noted that in the period leading up to the day of the murder, Ryan's behavior became even more suspicious and disturbing. He was irritable, sometimes even aggressive, avoided communication, and tried to stay away from family and friends. These changes in mood and anxiety, she said, caused her concern and anxiety. Pam's testimony played an important role in the investigation, as it not only confirmed the motive, jealousy and animosity, but also added specifics to the picture, allowing investigators to draw clearer conclusions. Her words became a strong argument for the prosecution and ultimately helped break the case out of years of stagnation. Based on all the evidence gathered, including Pam's testimony, forensic findings, and behavioral analysis, investigators charged Ryan with first-degree murder. This meant that the investigation had identified a specific suspect and that the charges were based on compelling evidence. Ryan was arrested at his home in Grand Haven, Western Michigan, where he lived with his family. This happened in early 2014, almost 3 decades after the murder. At the time of his arrest, Ryan was at home and did not expect the case to take such a serious turn again. The police carried out the arrest calmly to avoid possible resistance and maintain order. Ryan was informed of his rights and taken to the station for further questioning and procedural actions. His arrest caused a great stir in the local community, with many shocked that a crime that seemed long forgotten was once again in the spotlight. This moment marked a turning point in the case. After years of despair, the legal proceedings had finally begun and the community had hope for a just conclusion to the tragedy. The trial of Ryan Weingarten accused of murdering his sister Gail and her husband Rick Brink, began in April 2014 in the Ottawa County Circuit Court in Michigan. The case had attracted a great deal of public attention. The investigation had lasted almost 3 decades, and now the entire town was watching the proceedings with bated breath. The courtroom was packed with members of the press, town residents, relatives of the victims, and human rights activists who were closely monitoring developments. The atmosphere in the courtroom was tense. On one side were experienced defense attorneys who persistently pointed to the lack of direct evidence and insisted that their client was innocent. On the other hand, the prosecutors, who had prepared an extensive case file including forensic reports, witness statements, and other evidence, confidently presented their case. Ryan Weingarten behaved in a restrained and calm manner, but at times his words behaved in a distraint and distrust of the court. During the trial, all the evidence gathered in the case was examined in detail. Forensic experts confirmed that Rick and Gail died from gunshot wounds inflicted at close range with a small caliber weapon. In addition, the court heard testimony from Pam Weingarten, the defendant's wife, who spoke about the difficult and tense family relationship, Ryan's motives, and his suspicious behavior in the period leading up to the tragedy. Her testimony sparked considerable controversy and became key to the case. The defense attempted to discredit the witness, claiming that she may have a personal interest in accusing her husband and emphasizing the possible bias in her testimony. Nevertheless, the jury carefully weighed all the arguments and evidence, heard additional testimony and expert opinions, and then retired to deliberate. The psychological and emotional aspects of the case were also discussed during the trial. Assessments of the defendant's mental state were presented, and motives, including jealousy and a desire to hide family secrets, were examined in detail. This allowed for a more complete understanding of the events that led to the tragedy. After several hours of closed-door deliberation, the jury unanimously found Ryan Weingarten guilty of first-degree murder. The verdict elicited mixed feelings in the courtroom. For some, it was a long-awaited and just decision, while for others, it was a cause for reflection and doubt. Judge John Hulsing, who presided over the trial, maintained strict order and ensured that the proceedings were conducted without emotional outbursts. During the sentencing, the defendant, overcome with rage and disappointment, directed harsh words at the judge, calling him a liar. This behavior prompted a sharp response from the judge, who threatened severe measures if it happened again. On April 25, 2014, the Ottawa District Court found Ryan Weingarten guilty of 2 crimes: first-degree murder of Rick and Gail Brink. On April 30, 2014, Ryan Weingarten was sentenced to life imprisonment without the possibility of parole. Alessandra Mattuzzi was born on March 15, 1966 in Bologna, northern Italy. Her family was not wealthy, but close-knit. Her father worked as an engineer at a local factory, and her mother was a high school teacher. The family also had a younger brother who played an important role in Alessandra's life from childhood. Her parents instilled in their children a sense of responsibility and honesty, as well as the importance of education and respect for others. From childhood, Alessandra was distinguished by her calm, even-tempered character and ability to find common ground with people. She was a diligent student, showed a keen interest in her studies, and always strove to be better. At school, she stood out not only for her good grades, but also for her active lifestyle. She participated in community events, helped younger students with their homework, and often gave speeches at school celebrations. After graduating from high school, Alessandra enrolled at the University of Bologna to study fashion design and management. This decision was conscious and dictated by her passion for the world of fashion. At university, she proved herself to be a talented student. She took part in competitions, organized exhibitions and shows, and became involved in various projects which helped her build professional connections and gain experience. During her studies, she realized that she wanted to devote her life to fashion and beauty, and after successfully completing her studies, she got a job at a well-known showroom in Bologna, where she was involved in sales and collection coordination. Alessandra was not only a professional, but also a caring person for whom family was very important. Despite her busy work schedule, she always found time for her family and friends. She had a special bond with her younger sister Stefania. They often called each other, shared secrets, and supported each other in difficult times. There were no major turning points in Alessandra's life until Giovanni Padovani appeared in her life. They met through mutual friends and social media in early 2021. Giovanni was a soccer player and model from another city, a young man with charisma and a strong character. Despite the significant age difference, Alessandra was almost 30 years older. They began to communicate, and soon their relationship turned romantic. Their first dates were light and pleasant, walks in the park, dinners together, and conversations late into the night. Giovanni was attractive and confident, and Alessandra appreciated his enthusiasm and ambition. It seemed that they had every chance of building a strong relationship. But over time, differences began to arise between them. Living in different cities and being constantly busy took their toll. Communication became strained, and misunderstandings became a frequent occurrence in their relationship. It was especially difficult to cope with the jealousy and control that Giovanni increasingly displayed. He tried to restrict Alessandra's freedom and made demands on her friends and social circle. At first, Alessandra dismissed this as emotional turmoil and attempts to save the relationship, but over time it became clear that the problem was much more serious. Her inner peace and sense of security were under threat. By January 2022, the tension had reached a peak. After one of their arguments, which included threats and accusations, Alessandra realized that the relationship could become dangerous. She tried to end it, but Giovanni did not want to let her go. From that moment on, his behavior became more intrusive and aggressive, stalking, threatening phone calls, and attempts to control her movements. They broke up, but Giovanni continued to follow her and interfere in her life. Alessandra tried to fight back. She turned to friends and relatives for help and tried to ignore his calls and messages. But the constant pressure did not stop. On the evening of Tuesday, August 23, 2022, Alessandra was returning home from work. It was a warm but not too hot August evening. She parked her car on Via dell'Arco dei Giudici, in the neighborhood where she had lived for the past few years. The street was quiet, with few pedestrians and only a handful of cars parked along the sidewalk. Alessandra was having a relaxed conversation on the phone with her sister Stefania. They were discussing plans for the weekend and sharing news. It seemed like it would be a normal, uneventful evening. However, standing nearby on the sidewalk was a man who had arrived in the area earlier and was waiting for Alessandra. None of the passers-by knew who he was or what his intentions were. When Alessandra got out of her car, still holding the phone to her ear and continuing her conversation, the man suddenly attacked her. He was holding a heavy metal object, a hammer, which he had grabbed from his car. The blow came suddenly, leaving the woman almost no time to defend herself. Alessandra felt a sharp pain, but tried to fight back, run away, and scream. The attack continued. The attacker used not only the hammer, but also his fists, kicked her, grabbed her, and beat her with various objects. All this horror unfolded before the eyes of Alessandra's sister, Stefania, who was on the phone. She heard screams, the sounds of a struggle, and desperate attempts to defend herself. Realizing that something terrible was happening, Stefania immediately called the police, trying to stay connected with her sister and help her in any way she could over the phone. That evening was fateful for Alessandra. What began as a normal conversation on the doorstep of her own home turned into a tragedy. Her life had been filled with struggles and attempts to preserve her freedom and dignity, but at that moment, everything came to an end. What seemed like an unexpected and terrifying moment was the result of months of persecution and violence. The silence of Via dell'Arco dei Crocieri was broken by loud screams and the sounds of a struggle. None of the passers-by intervened in time, and only Stefania's timely phone call alerted the police. When the police arrived at the scene, they were met with an alarming and tense scene. The evening street of Via dell'Arco dei Crociati, which was usually quiet and peaceful, was now marred by a horrific scene of violence. Alessandra Matuzzi was standing on the sidewalk near a parked car, her clothes torn and covered in blood. Despite the severity of her injuries, she was still alive and conscious, although her condition was extremely serious. The police immediately called an ambulance. Paramedics arrived within minutes and, after assessing the woman's condition, began to administer first aid at the scene. Alessandra was struggling desperately to breathe, her face contorted with a mixture of pain and horror. After her condition stabilized, the woman was rushed to the nearest hospital, where doctors began intensive care. They made every effort, using all available methods to save her life, but her injuries were too severe and incompatible with life. A few hours after her arrival, Alessandra died. The fight for her life ended in tragedy. Investigators began a thorough examination of the crime scene. The first priority was to collect all evidence that could help solve the crime. Several items related to the attack were found around Alessandra's car. Among them was a hammer, a heavy metal tool that was presumably used to deliver the first and most severe blow. The hammer was covered in bloodstains and appeared to have been discarded near the scene of the crime. Investigators also found traces of blood on a nearby bench located a few meters from the car. This indicated that during the attack, the victim may have been beaten not only on the sidewalk but also near the bench. Traces of blood were scattered throughout the area, with some drops leading to a nearby courtyard, suggesting that the fight may have moved slightly. A phone was found next to the victim's body. It was broken, the screen was cracked, but the device remained on. The phone became one of the key pieces of evidence for the investigation, as it could contain important information: calls, messages, recorded conversations, and possible contacts that could shed light on who might have been involved in the attack. Traces possibly belonging to the attacker were also found near the car and the bench. Pieces of fabric from clothing. All of this evidence was immediately secured and sent to a forensic laboratory for analysis. However, the police acted quickly, understanding that time was of the essence in solving the crime. Since the murder had occurred recently, investigators began patrolling the area, trying to interview possible witnesses, check CCTV cameras, and track the movements of suspicious individuals. Special attention was paid to analyzing Alessandra's phone. With the help of experts, specialists tried to recover her last calls and messages to determine who she had been in contact with in the hours before the attack. This phone analysis could provide important clues if, for example, a contact associated with threats or harassment appeared in her call or message history. There were also plans to interview Alessandra's relatives and acquaintances to find out if she had any conflicts and who might have had a motive and the means to commit such violence. However, this stage was to be carried out at a later date, as the priority was to quickly assess the scene and gather as much evidence as possible. The crime scene bore traces of brutality and a violent struggle. Alessandra's blood was on the sidewalk, on the car, on the bench, and in several places near the house. Based on the size and location of the bloodstains, investigators were able to reconstruct the approximate course of events. The sequence of the fight, where the main blows were struck, and where Alessandra tried to dodge or defend herself. Despite all efforts, the fact remained tragic. There were too many injuries, and they were inflicted with particular cruelty. The strength and determination of the attacker were evident, revealing him to be not just a random passerby, but someone who knew the victim and was determined to harm her. The actions of the police and ambulance services were coordinated as much as possible. Despite Alessandra's serious condition, the emergency services did everything they could to save her. But even their professionalism and speed proved powerless in the face of the extent of her injuries. The situation at the crime scene remained tense for several hours. Investigators not only collected evidence, but also tried to maintain order and cordon off the area from outsiders so that nothing would be damaged or disappear. Local residents who heard about what had happened were shocked. No one could believe that such a tragedy could have occurred in their quiet and peaceful neighborhood. Many of them knew Alessandro as a kind and helpful person who was always ready to lend a hand. At the same time, investigators began working with neighbors and acquaintances, asking if they had noticed any strangers or unusual behavior in the area, and gathering information about Alessandra's past conflicts and people with whom she might have had problems. Despite all the information gathered, the investigation initially progressed slowly. The main witness, Alessandra's sister, was unable to name the attacker, and the victim unfortunately did not survive to assist the investigation. The police understood that time was against them and that every hour was crucial in preventing the perpetrator from escaping. Thus, in the early stages, the investigation relied mainly on physical evidence, analysis of digital traces, and statements from those around her. Investigators were in constant contact with relatives and loved ones to obtain as much information as possible and coordinate their actions. This stage of the investigation was a crucial moment that would determine the future of the case. The speed and competence with which the evidence was gathered would determine whether the perpetrator could be punished and similar tragedies prevented in the future. While the identity of the perpetrator remained unknown, the foundations had been laid for further investigation, during which new facts and evidence would be uncovered. The investigators had a long and painstaking task ahead of them, aimed at restoring justice and preserving the memory of the deceased Alessandro Mattuzzi. After quickly analyzing Alessandro Mattuzzi's phone, the police obtained key information that allowed them to steer the investigation in the right direction. Despite damage to the device, forensic experts were able to recover most of the victim's correspondence, calls, and messages from the last days and hours before the attack. The phone, which had witnessed the last moments of Alessandro's life, contained information that soon became the basis for identifying the suspect. A key discovery was the fact that at the time of the attack, Alessandro was talking on the phone with her sister Stefania. The sister, who was on the other end of the line, became an unwitting witness to the tragedy. Stefania became an important informant for the investigation. Her interrogation was conducted according to standard procedure, with strict adherence to all legal norms. During the interrogation, she recounted the conversation in detail. According to her, Alessandro's voice was filled with fear and pain, and her intonation betrayed pleas for mercy and desperate cries. The name Giovanni was mentioned several times during the conversation, although not clearly, but clearly enough to attract the attention of the investigator. Giovanni Padovani is a 27-year-old Italian footballer and model born in northern Italy. He played as a defender for a Serie D team, the lowest division of Italian football, where players often combine sport with other activities or work part-time. Giovanni was known for his good looks, which allowed him to pursue a modeling career alongside his football career. His participation in photo shoots and advertising campaigns brought him additional income and a certain degree of fame among young athletes. In his personal life, Giovanni was known as a man with a strong character and charisma. But his relationship with Alessandro Mattuzzi was fraught with tension and conflict. Despite the noticeable age difference, he was almost 30 years younger than her, they began a romantic relationship which soon became complicated due to Giovanni's intrusive and controlling behavior. According to the investigation, he was prone to aggressive outbursts and jealousy, which ultimately led to tragic consequences. This discovery was a turning point in the investigation. Investigators began examining Alessandra's phone correspondence with a man named Giovanni. The correspondence revealed a history of complex, tense, and painful relationships between the victim and this man. The messages contained a lot of aggression and control on Giovanni's part. Threats, reproaches, accusations, and attempts to restrict Alessandra's freedom. These were not just emotions, but systematic psychological pressure that clearly reflected the tension in their relationship. An examination of the correspondence and phone calls showed that the man behaved in an extremely intrusive and controlling manner. He constantly demanded reports on Alessandra's movements, was distrustful of her contacts and friends, often threatened her, and did not allow her to live in peace. The correspondence showed that the stalking was long-term, systematic abuse, not just a one-off conflict. In parallel with examining digital traces, investigators turned to official databases and crime statistics. They checked whether Alessandro had previously sought help from law enforcement agencies. The results of the check confirmed their fears. In recent months, Alessandro had repeatedly filed complaints about harassment and threats from a man whose name matched that of Giovanni. According to archival data, several statements were registered in which Alessandro pointed to attempts at persecution and interference in her personal life. One of the documents stated that the man had tried to break into her apartment, damage her property, and even climb onto her balcony. However, despite these reports, protective measures were not properly implemented, and the man continued to stalk Alessandra. This discovery was serious confirmation that the investigation had a key suspect, a man with a clear motive, the means, and a clear desire to cause harm. The crime began to unravel, revealing new details about the suspect's character and motives. A portrait of the criminal was pieced together from descriptions provided by neighbors and acquaintances, as well as information obtained from digital traces. An important part of the work was the recovery of deleted messages and hidden chats, a painstaking and complex task that required the professional intervention of specialists. It was thanks to this recovered data that the investigation was able to see a more complete picture of what had happened. Not only was the correspondence between Alessandra and Giovanni checked, but also the suspect's messages with other individuals. This helped to determine whether he had any accomplices or people who could advise or support him in committing the crime. Records of conversations and dialogues were found in which certain conflicts and plans were discussed, indicating that the suspect may have been preparing for the attack in advance. The investigation also revealed that the suspect had not only been stalking Alessandra, but had also been actively trying to control her life. His actions included attempts to interfere in her domestic and personal life, damaging her car, tampering with her meters, and attempting to break into her home. These facts underscored the danger he posed to the victim. By the time the police had gathered all this information, it was clear that they were not dealing with a random criminal, but with a man with a deep motive and a complex relationship with the victim. This was not just a case of physical violence, but of systematic psychological and emotional pressure. The investigators understood that in order to successfully complete the investigation, they needed to gather as much evidence as possible to bring convincing charges against the suspect. The tangled web of crime, which seemed complex and confusing, began to unravel thanks to the professionalism and tenacity of the investigators. Ultimately, through a comprehensive analysis of digital data, witness testimony, and archival documents, the investigation identified the name and identity of the main suspect, Giovanni Padovani. The next step was to prepare an operation to arrest him and gather additional evidence. Once investigators had obtained conclusive evidence of Giovanni Padovani's involvement in the brutal attack on Alessandra Mattuzzi, the decisive stage of the investigation began: the search for and arrest of the suspect. The realization that they were dealing with a man capable of premeditated and brutal murder required the police to act with maximum efficiency and coordination. Not only did the quality and speed of their work determine whether the crime would be solved, but also the safety of the public. The first step was to carefully track Giovanni's movements. The police studied mobile phone data to establish the last locations of the suspect. In addition, Giovanni's acquaintances, friends, and colleagues were interviewed, and CCTV footage from the crime scene was analyzed. These measures made it possible to reconstruct the suspect's approximate route, which significantly narrowed the search area. A key piece of information was that Giovanni had missed his soccer team's training session on the day of the murder. This fact aroused the suspicion of the coaching staff and people close to him, who reported it to the police. His absence from training without a valid reason was a significant clue, given the suspect's tense relationship with Alessandra. The search led police officers to a suburb of Bologna, where Giovanni often stayed and had acquaintances. On August 24, the day after the tragedy, investigators found him in a small rented apartment. Despite the seriousness of the situation, Giovanni behaved calmly, which gave law enforcement officers the impression that he was hiding inner tension behind his unruffled exterior. The arrest went smoothly. Giovanni was immediately taken to the police station for questioning. One of the first steps was fingerprinting and DNA sampling, standard practice when arresting suspects in serious crimes. Evidence against the suspect emerged from a comparative analysis of fingerprints. Fingerprints were found on the hammer, the murder weapon, which, after fingerprint analysis, matched Giovanni Padovani's fingerprints perfectly. This virtually ruled out any mistake and made him a direct participant in the attack. The findings of the examination were carefully documented and included in the case file. This match became one of the central arguments of the prosecution and significantly strengthened the position of the investigation. The suspect was questioned in the first hours after his arrest. Giovanni gave his testimony in the presence of a lawyer and investigators. During the interrogation, he quickly confessed to the crime, describing his actions and motives in detail. According to him, his relationship with Alessandra was initially filled with love and mutual affection, but over time, conflicts and tensions began to arise between them. Feelings of jealousy, despair, and loss of control over the situation led Giovanni to a state where he decided to take extreme measures. He admitted that he could not accept Alessandra's decision to end the relationship and felt a strong sense of resentment and anger. This prompted him to commit an act of violence that led to tragic consequences. Giovanni's testimony confirmed the investigators' assumptions about the existence of a personal motive, reinforced by psychological pressure and aggression. In addition to the confession, the case file contained a detailed chronology of events, confirmed by witnesses and digital evidence. The investigation paid particular attention to the fact that the crime had been carefully planned. The suspect deliberately skipped training to prepare for the meeting and took a hammer and other items with him, which he used in the attack. All of this pointed to the premeditated and deliberate nature of the crime, which significantly aggravated Giovanni's guilt and ruled out the possibility of impulsive or active. The evidence gathered, the testimony and the confessions made the charges against Giovanni Padovani indisputable. The investigation and the prosecution had sufficient evidence to charge him with premeditated murder with particular cruelty, as well as with persecution and violence preceding the crime. There was confidence that the court would consider the case with the utmost severity and impose a deserved punishment. The case files were officially transferred to the prosecutor's office, and preparations for the trial began. Prosecutors carefully prepared the indictment, including all the circumstances of the crime and evidence confirming the defendant's guilt. The publicity of the case, the high level of public interest, and the seriousness of the charges put pressure on the judicial system. The authorities recognized the need not only for a fair punishment but also for a demonstration of their determination to combat domestic violence and persecution. Thus, the capture of Giovanni Padovani was a decisive moment in the investigation, paving the way for further justice and ensuring that a fair verdict could be reached. His arrest and confession allowed investigators to complete their evidence gathering and prepare the case for trial. The trial of Giovanni Padovani became one of the most high-profile cases involving domestic violence and murder in Italy in recent years. The criminal case was heard in the Bologna court, where particular attention was paid to the thorough analysis of all the evidence gathered, witness statements, and the positions of the prosecution and defense. The trial was closely followed by the public and the media, which only added to the tension and significance of the case. The hearings began several months after Giovanni's arrest. During this time, the investigation prepared a complete package of evidence, including forensic reports, fingerprint analysis, transcripts of telephone conversations and correspondence, as well as witness statements, including those of the victim, Alessandra's sister. During the court hearings, prosecutors detailed the circumstances of the crime, emphasizing the premeditated nature of the murder as well as the prolonged persecution and psychological pressure to which the victim was subjected. Particular emphasis was placed on the brutality of the attack, the use of a hammer and other improvised objects, as well as the fact that the crime took place in front of the victim's sister, who became the main witness to the tragedy. The prosecution demanded the maximum punishment, taking into account all the aggravating circumstances. In their arguments, they emphasized that Padovani had not simply committed murder, but had systematically persecuted Alessandro, violating her right to safety and life. The defense tried to mitigate their client's guilt by arguing that he had a tough personal life and was in a bad place mentally. They tried to show him as someone who was really stressed out and couldn't control himself when he did it. However, these arguments did not resonate with the court, given the scale and nature of the crime, as well as Padovani's own confessions. Numerous witnesses testified in court, helping to reconstruct the chronology of events and confirm the nature of the relationship between the defendant and the victim. Among them were colleagues, friends, acquaintances, as well as experts in psychology and forensic medicine. Their testimonies complemented each other, forming a complete and consistent picture of what had happened. The court was particularly moved by the speech of Alessandro's sister Stefania, who emotionally recounted the last minutes of her sister's life, the pleas and fears she heard over the phone. Her testimony was a powerful emotional and evidentiary factor that underscored the tragedy of the case. The trial lasted several weeks, during which the parties presented their arguments and the court carefully examined all the evidence. Each hearing was conducted in strict order, with all legal procedures and the rights of the participants being observed. The judges asked questions and clarified details, paying attention to every aspect of the case. After all the hearings were completed, the court retired to deliver its verdict. This decision was awaited with great tension. Not only did it determine the fate of the accused, but it also sent a message to the whole society about how domestic violence and femicide would be dealt with. On February 13, 2024, the Bologna court found Giovanni Padovani guilty of the crimes of premeditated murder with aggravating circumstances, stalking, and violence against Alessandro Mattuzzi. He was sentenced to life imprisonment without the possibility of parole.